This is the first part of What if Deku had 10 Shadow Quirk? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Narrator. Thoughts. Whispers. Setting. Muzutafu. Everyone talks about helping others, but few make a difference between their actions and words. People often act based on what brings them pleasure or, unconsciously, on their aversion to certain aspects of their lives. The world doesn't adapt to us because everyone has their own way of seeing life. You simply have to know how to face reality. Approaching a certain residence among several apartments, one could see inside a very nice house a certain green-haired boy with a tuft covering his right eye, preparing to leave his home. Izuku Midoriya was an ordinary teenager like any other in a world where the supernatural reigns. Originally, he was quirkless or without a quirk when he was born, but when he discovered his superpower, he realized he was different from the rest. It seemed he had awakened his quirk later than others, possibly due to the motivation to help others that ignited his ability. The green-haired boy still remembered how he activated his quirk unconsciously as a child, and it was amusing. He did it to protect another boy who was being bullied. However, he ended up getting in trouble because his Shikigami frightened the other children, and they told their parents. That innocence led to Izuku having to apologize, as they threatened to take action if he didn't. Although Izuku considered refusing, he decided to comply because he didn't want to cause trouble for his mother. Now, Midoriya's current goal was to become a hero who would help others with a smile, but he felt that his resources were very limited, all thanks to a video of the #1 hero helping people during a fire. This was because if he wanted to be a hero, he had to get into UA Academy, and for that, he had to be accepted first. The problem was that the acceptance rate for UA was only 0.02%, which made Izuku analyze all the opportunities he could have. All this while finishing his breakfast and getting ready to go to his secondary school. Maybe if I manage to stand out in the entrance exam, I could get in, but how will I achieve that if I can't even get in first place? I assume that after seeing my application, they will decide if I am worthy of attending their school. Izuku sighed and then put his backpack on his shoulders. It was frustrating, he thought while walking down the hallway of his house with his hand on his chin. His mother would come home late after her shift at the hospital, as always. He put on his shoes and then stood up to head for the door. I'll be waiting for her. He turned the lock with the key and then opened the door, closing it behind him. Midoriya walked calmly through the city streets. Everything was so quiet that the green-haired boy found it suspicious, as he never trusted the weather and wondered what could happen on a day like this. His pace was unhurried. He always arrived earlier than the others to avoid the loudness of his friend, Kaken, who had become much noisier in recent days. That boy had gained a confidence in himself, similar to a complex that made him feel superior to others, and that confidence was backed by his quirk, which turned his sweat into nitroglycerin that could explode. He and Izuku were good friends. Since Bakugo and he had a small fight as children, which involved how Izuku defended another boy who was being bullied by Bakugo's friends. They had a scuffle that was intervened by their parents, however, since then, they hadn't gotten along as well as before. This didn't bother Midoriya, he didn't want to associate with bad people who didn't even try to relate to others. Though, one could say the same about me, since I haven't spoken to him since then, he thought, looking down. Should I try to talk to him? But I don't think it's a good time. Besides, he shouldn't care what I do. Izuku stopped at a traffic light when he saw it was red. He tried to walk forward but heard a loud screech around the corner and saw a car speeding toward him. The green-haired boy frowned slightly, stepping back to give way to the hurried driver. I guess he's in a hurry. Huh. He saw some girls pass by his side, and they seemed unaware of the impending danger. Deku hurriedly leaned toward the girls, grabbing their arms and pulling them back just in time. The car sped by, leaving a small cloud of dust in the air. Izuku, still holding onto both girls, released them once they were out of danger. Excuse me, are you okay? He asked, but he was interrupted when he sensed imminent danger. Midoriya moved quickly, jumping to the side to avoid a large wall of ice that nearly crashed into him, freezing a nearby wall completely. He turned to look up and found two heterochromatic eyes, one blue and one black, along with a large burn scar on the left side of a woman's face. She had half red, half white hair, and beside her stood a girl with glasses, white hair, and small red highlights on her head. The bicolor girl had her left arm extended toward the fallen Midoriya, looking at him threateningly while shielding the other girl, whom he assumed was her sister. "Do you need something, pervert? Don't try to touch a lady if you don't know what manners are," she spoke coldly and ruthlessly. "Leave before I freeze you to the bone." She raised her left hand to signal that she was serious. Izuku had wide eyes, still on the ground. Didn't that girl realize she had just saved his life from a potential fatal injury? Sometimes, Izuku considered that patience, besides being a virtue, was a gift that allowed one to react to different conflicts without losing their composure. The teenager sighed, stood up, and brushed off his clothes to meet the bicolor girl's gaze, almost matching the same coldness she showed him. "Miss, this is a misunderstanding." He adjusted his uniform tie. "I only helped you to prevent you from getting hurt while crossing the street. A car was coming at high speed, and I had no other intentions than that," he spoke calmly. The girl looked at him for a moment, not seeming very convinced by what the boy was saying, but Izuku could no longer afford to waste time or he would be late. The green-haired boy sighed and walked alongside the two girls, glancing at the bicolor-haired one for a moment. As the world around them fell silent, she felt a dark emptiness in his eyes that seemed to swallow her whole, leaving her stunned for a few seconds. He decided to leave it to their imagination whether to believe him or not, but he had matters to attend to, so he averted his gaze and began to walk a bit faster too. Avoid being late. Chapter End. Location: Dagoba Beach. Dagoba Beach had become the current dumping ground in Mizudafu, where people discarded items they no longer used or leftovers from their meals, leaving the cleanup to the heroes as if they were their servants. The sound of dull thuds began to echo from within Dagoba. Approaching closer, one could see Deku fighting with a large black-bladed sword against a giant lycanthrope, who was skillfully dodging the green-haired boy's attacks and countering with powerful bites. Izuku would be lying if he said he always kept up with his teammates during physical activity, but he was improving that aspect against Cabal, his demon dogs in their totality form. This form enhanced their senses, strength, speed, and endurance. The teenager moved agilely, blocking the claws of his Shikigami, sending sparks flying into the air. He had a few cuts on his cheeks, and his breathing was somewhat erratic, but it was clear that Cabal was in better shape, showing no signs of fatigue. The battle continued, with Izuku primarily focused on blocking and deflecting Cabal's attacks while the lycanthrope gradually cornered him. The sounds of screeching, dull thuds, and the clashing jaws of the jade wolf filled the beach, but fortunately, no one was sunbathing or swimming, as Dagoba Beach had lost its popularity due to the trash. Izuku quickly dodged a bite aimed at his chest, but the Shikigami was more cunning, sprinting like a quadruped and knocking him off his feet, sending him crashing into a large pile of trash he had gathered himself. Izuku writhed a bit on the sand next to the garbage. As he tried to get up, Cabal approached and stood in front of him, liking his master's face in a sign of victory. A slight smile appeared on Izuku's face, finding the spirit's reaction amusing. As he stood, he gave Cabal a gentle pat. They had been training together for at least 3 sessions, and now Izuku began to move large amounts of trash while the lycanthrope kept watch. Slowly he piled up the trash using a pair of black fabric gloves, forming a large mountain of waste. Occasionally, he would find exotic materials or valuable items, which he stored in his backpack to see what he could create later. It was an effective way to craft weapons or anything else he might need without spending money. Several days had passed since he submitted his application to the academy for the entrance exam, and luck was on his side as he was accepted. The boy had to study many things in the first few days, which felt overwhelming, but he accepted that to fulfill his dream, he had to work hard. He realized that not everything was so bad, as he had nearly perfected his hero suit, adding the specifications he wanted for when it was ready. Now, he just needed to shine in the exam, aiming for the highest rank on the scoreboard, just like All Might, even though he didn't want to be that hero. He wanted to be much more. Midoriya continued training, moving large piles of trash while practicing with his sword, making cuts in the air. Occasionally he would train alongside Cabal, who watched each of his movements closely. Sometimes, Cabal would help him rearrange or move heavy refrigerators, crushing them with the Shikigami's strength. However, Izuku found it challenging to concentrate because a certain blonde man, with a skeletal build, had been watching his movements for about an hour and a half from behind a wall. Toshinori Yagi, better known as All Might, the symbol of peace and the strongest man on Earth, had once defeated the most powerful villain 4 years ago, someone who stood in stark contrast to what he represented. That villain met a tragic end when All Might defeated him, smashing his head against the concrete, bringing peace to the people of Japan. However, that day, Toshinori suffered a severe injury, losing part of his respiratory system and a quarter of his stomach. This injury reduced the flow of power he had, the One for All, a gift bestowed upon a young Toshinori, who now had only 3 to 4 hours to use it before reverting to the thin, shadowy figure that many mistook for a vagabond. People could not see or were unaware of the great damage All Might had sustained during that battle. Now, the important task was to find a new successor to pass on the One for All and create a new symbol of peace before the world faced a potential new threat. Several days prior, he had asked his friend Sir Night Eye to help him find a suitable candidate with his quirk. He discovered a talented young man named Haru Satu, who possessed a quirk that allowed him to increase his muscle mass, granting him greater density and strength, along with experience in hand-to-hand combat. He had the spirit of a hero, courage, and a sense of justice that drove him to defend others. The number 1 hero would have handed over his power after asking certain questions to ensure he was making the right choice. However, a young boy with fluffy hair, slightly shorter than him, and a lock that covered his right eye, giving him an emo appearance, caught the attention of Japan's number 1 hero. What intrigued him most was witnessing how the boy fought skillfully against a creature resembling a werewolf, wielding a large sword. Toshinori was impressed by the boy's agility in close combat. Initially, he thought about intervening, believing the boy was in danger, but he paused when he saw the boy simply raise his hand, commanding the creature to stop. After training with him for a while, Toshinori realized the boy had a unique quirk, one that allowed him to control the giant wolf as if it were a pet. This boy could be a candidate to inherit my power, he thought to himself quietly, not wanting Izuku to perceive him as a creep due to his worn appearance. The boy seemed determined, and his efforts to clean the beach showed he cared about the environment. However, the aura he emitted did not seem fitting for a symbol of peace. The hero murmured, unaware that Izuku could hear him perfectly. Izuku was questioning 2 things. Who was this man, and what power did he possess that made him consider passing it on? Unsure of how to respond, Izuku decided to pretend he was unaware of the man's presence and continued training with Cabal. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with Toshinori secretly observing Izuku as he diligently cleaned the beach, moving debris piece by piece. He noticed Izuku only summoned Cabal in its base form, as the boy was hesitant to reveal his other Shikigami to a stranger, driven by caution and distrust. After 10 months, Izuku had studied nearly everything he needed for the written exam, and now he was left to see what would happen in the practical portion, which remained a mystery. He still couldn't decipher who that strange man was, but he chose not to dwell on it as long as the man stayed out of his affairs. Initially, he had considered questioning him, suspecting he might be a spy, but he held back, sensing an instinctive warning, "Don't get too close," assuming the man was not what he seemed. Currently, the green-haired boy was walking through the hallways of his school, feeling calm since it was the last hour of classes. He decided to stroll a bit for a change. As he walked with his hands in his pockets, he felt a wave of boredom wash over him, nearly dozing off while standing. The past few months had allowed him to refine some of his techniques related to his quirk and finalize the design for the suit he would wear if he managed to get into UA. He hadn't interacted with Bakugo in recent days, which puzzled him. Bakugo usually bothered him during lunch or when he was alone, especially since they both planned to attend the same academy. But this time, he hadn't. Izuku speculated that after Todoroki had defended him, Bakugo might have decided it was better not to provoke him. However, he also believed Bakugo didn't care much, as he and Todoroki were not friends. He assumed Todoroki merely regarded him as a classmate. He rarely saw her, as she often left quickly without waiting for anyone. He couldn't deny that something about her intrigued him, perhaps the mystery surrounding her family name. Before he could think further, he turned a corner and bumped into someone, causing them to fall backward. He looked down to see a bicolor white and red-haired girl who had fallen due to their sudden collision. He paused for a moment before extending his hand to help her up. He expressed his concern, asking if she was all right while maintaining a serious yet slightly lighter expression. Todoroki looked at him and then at his outstretched hand, hesitating for a moment. Ultimately, she decided to accept his help, rising carefully. As he held her hand for a few seconds, he noticed how soft and delicate it felt, though slightly cold. He brushed off the latter detail as she stood up and offered a small bow as a gesture of thanks. He watched her for a moment as she walked away, her hair reaching down to her waist, contrasting with her beauty. He imagined that if she heard him say that, she would either punch him or freeze him. Shrugging, he returned his hands to his jacket pockets and wandered aimlessly through the hallways. He had no rush as there were still about 10 minutes left in the break. He decided to head to the back of the yard, where they were constructing a baseball field that had begun 2 months prior. After a few minutes of walking down some stairs and taking a few steps, he found himself alone, which relaxed him, allowing him to enjoy a moment of peace. He then climbed over the metal fence, heading into the restricted area until the field was completed. He walked across the grass under the sunlight, feeling the gentle breeze and the tranquility of the surroundings, accompanied by the faint vibrations in the air. I approached a nearby tree located at the corner of the area next to the team benches. Sitting beneath the canopy of the oak, I took a moment to appreciate my school and the sky stretching for miles above. Thoughts crossed my mind about various students who might also gain admission to UA, whether from my school or elsewhere. This led me to ponder what would happen if I were accepted. It seemed straightforward to me. I just needed to overcome whatever obstacles presented themselves at the right moment. It was surprising how often I thought about this, though I felt a bit nervous as the great day approached. In recent months, I had been discovering interesting things about my quirk. One of the revelations involved the method of summoning I used, which consisted of manipulating countless shadows to create a stop, shape, or what I called a seal, with my hands, allowing the formation of my Shikigami. I also discovered that I could interact with the base form of my spirits, specifically changing the density of the viscous black substance, making it harder, although it was more challenging than when it was in a liquid state. What intrigued me most was that I could hide objects in my shadow for transportation. The density and volume I used to summon one of my Shikigami could vary in size and shape, allowing some of them to adapt their height to the situation, which was very practical. I placed my hand on the grass beside me, sinking my fingers into the shadow reflected in my palm. After a few moments, I pulled out a portion of the golden hilt with a red grip, attached to a sharp black blade that formed my sword. I had acquired this weapon from a shop specializing in gadgets, having saved up to buy it. After that thought, I returned the sword to the shadows, feeling satisfied with how much I had improved compared to before. Suddenly, I heard footsteps and sensed someone standing in front of me. Instinctively, I looked up to find a certain bicolor girl staring intently at me. I was surprised to see Todoroki here. Before I realized it, she sat down beside me. I wasn't sure if she wanted to talk or if she had come to relax like I had. I looked at her for a moment before asking why she was here, especially since neither of us should have been in this spot. Todoroki sighed and looked ahead, admitting that she was just looking for a quiet place to think, noting the heat of the day. I considered her words. They made sense. We both gazed at the horizon in silence, the warm summer air surrounding us. I had to admit, this was the first time someone had sat next to me in my secret spot, or not so secret if she already knew about this construction site. Sitting to Todoroki's left, I felt a refreshing breeze brush against me. It was curious how she always faced me with her right side in class, sometimes making me feel warm, but now she was showing me her left side, which felt cooling. Could it be an effect of her quirk? Whatever it was refreshing as the heat I felt began to dissipate. Todoroki glanced at me, noticing my calm yet serious expression, which showed a hint of relaxation. She raised her hand and lightly poked my neck, causing me to flinch. I was taken aback, wondering why she had done that. Todoroki looked at me for a moment before returning her gaze to the front. She then asked if it was truly my dream to be a hero since childhood. I was a bit confused by her sudden question, unsure of where she was going with it, but she continued speaking. She shared that when she was young, she had watched a live video of All Might, the symbol of peace, saving people from a collapse caused by villains in a building. She closed her eyes for a moment before looking at me, revealing that she wanted to be a heroine because of a promise she made to someone very important to her. She stated that if we faced each other at UA, she wouldn't hold back just because we were in the same class. She intended to become someone much greater. I felt a mix of confusion and intrigue. It seemed like she was challenging me to compete in the entrance exam, but I could see something in her eyes, a flame of determination ignited by a desire to protect someone precious to her. I noticed a hint of nostalgia in her gaze, making me wonder about her past. I lowered my eyes, empathizing with her desire to rise to the top of the heroes and help her mother in the process. I turned to her again, acknowledging her resolve. Because I also don't plan to lose, I hope that if we meet in the entrance exam, it will be under better circumstances. She smiled slightly before looking at Todoroki with the same determination. The girl glanced at him for a moment and then nodded in response. She stood up to leave, as it was likely time for the last hour of classes to begin. Todoroki-kun wasn't lying when he said he would become a hero, but unfortunately, she was sure her father would give his recommendation to the director for her to enter UA without any issues. This thought irritated her because she knew she would have to prove that she deserved to be in that academy on her own merit, not just because of her father's influence. Her father, who must have planned this all along, but she refused to rely on her right side for anything, whether she was admitted or not. Izuku watched as the girl walked away, her fists clenched. She seemed upset about something, which he didn't quite understand since they didn't know each other well enough to decipher her emotions or what was going through Shoto's mind. He decided to get up from the floor and head to his last class. At least there was only 1 hour left. After school, he planned to explore the city instead of going to Dagoba because it was still early, and he might grab a bite to eat at a restaurant. Upon arriving in class, he encountered a scene that didn't surprise him. Almost all his classmates were gathered around Todoroki-kun, some sitting and others standing asking questions like, "Would you like to join my club? Are you as strong as the rumors say? Would you like to hang out after school?" He watched with exasperation as his classmates bombarded his seat neighbor with random questions and chose to ignore it for now, making his way to his own seat. After the teacher arrived, his classmates returned to their seats, and he could hear Todoroki sighing in relief that they had left him alone to take out his notebooks. Izuku would have liked to ask Todoroki-kun certain things, but he decided to hold back, feeling it would be awkward since they didn't know each other well. A few minutes later, class began. Most students started writing, while others did not, but he didn't mind. He just wanted to leave school and get something to eat. He was eager for a moment of relaxation before the entrance exam. After an hour, classes ended, and he calmly packed his things. He took out his phone to check the time, surprised to see it was 4 in the afternoon. He wasn't in a hurry to go home since his mother always returned late from the hospital. He would get back just in time to greet her, or rather, to check in on her since he usually only saw her in the morning when she was asleep. He started walking between the desks to exit the classroom when he heard voices behind him, noticing one was Todoroki-kun's serious and formal tone as he spoke with another boy who had approached him first. He didn't pay much attention and continued to leave the classroom as planned. However, just before he exited, he heard something that surprised him. The boy called out firmly to Todoroki-san, asking if she would like to go out with him after school and requested a response. Izuku glanced back over his shoulder, not expecting such a proposal, though he knew he shouldn't care. He was curious to see how she would respond. He watched as her serious expression remained unchanged. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in a romantic relationship at the moment, and I don't know you well enough to give you an honest answer." She made a small formal bow before passing by the boy. Izuku had anticipated her response, though she had been quite direct in saying she wasn't interested. He was still hidden by the door, having practically left the classroom without them noticing his presence, and he saw Todoroki-kun walk away in the opposite direction, heading towards the school exit. He felt a bit uneasy about how she had declined the boy's invitation, as he stood in silence, fists clenched in the empty classroom. All he could do was sigh and turn down the hallway to head directly for the school exit, feeling a gentle breeze brush against his cheek through the window. Now that he thought about it, there was little time left before the entrance exam began, which he had been counting down to. It would be in about 2 weeks, once these last 10 months were over. A few minutes later, he finally stepped out of the school, still in his uniform with his backpack slung over his shoulders. He walked through the streets of Mizudafu, enjoying the calm afternoon light from the sun, and nothing particularly interesting caught his eye. Until he heard a shout as he turned the corner of a building. Initially, he saw someone calling for help and ran toward the direction of the plea to see what was happening, finding a large villain made of mud sprinting away with a bag that he assumed contained stolen money or something valuable. What was the safety rate in Japan in such a supernatural world today? He could only sigh again at the thought. He looked around, noticing that people were merely watching or calling for help through their phones. He contemplated what to do, realizing that trying to chase down the villain might not be the most logical move, given the crowd around him that would draw attention. Perhaps he could use his shikigami from a distance or wait for another hero to arrive, but he wasn't sure if that villain would harm anyone, especially if they got in the way while trying to escape. Before he could analyze the situation further, he noticed the mud villain leap into the street and slip into a narrow, dark alley that prevented the local authorities from reaching him in time to apprehend him. I scratched my cheek hesitantly, realizing I had done little more than watch. I turned my gaze back down the path I had come from. It might not seem very heroic of me to hesitate at a call for help, but many people today take advantage of the chaos in the morning, and not everyone knows how to handle their abilities. As Midoriya walked away, a villain made of mud crawled through the underground water conduits, trying to remain hidden. He peered through a grate, observing 3 teenagers chatting about something he didn't pay much attention to, as he had found several small containers to hide in. A grin spread across his yellowed teeth. "Diamant. I still couldn't find Deku. That broccoli knows how to hide," he grumbled, annoyed, while crushing a can in his hand. One of Bakugu's friends approached him, giving him a light pat on the shoulder. He suggested they play video games to help him relax, smiling broadly. Bakugu shrugged and began to move forward into the alley where they were. The 3 boys were about to leave the alley when they suddenly noticed a foul, nauseating odor wafting from the sewer. It was a smell reminiscent of something rotten, emanating from the drain cover. The villain, with a wide smile on his face, watched the unsuspecting boys. Bakugu was the first to sense the presence behind him, turning just in time to see a massive mass of mud forming above them. He murmured in disbelief, realizing it was a villain. The mud villain lunged at the 3 boys. Bakugu reacted quickly, pushing his 2 friends away just in time. They looked back in confusion, but their surprise turned to shock as they saw the mud villain, the stench overwhelming them. Bakugu tried to distance himself, but the villain extended a limb like rubber, capturing his leg and dragging him closer, engulfing him in mud. Bakugu grunted in disgust as the mud forced its way into his mouth. He struggled to free himself, but it was futile. His arms and legs were immobilized. Frustration surged through him as he opened his eyes wide, extending his palms forward to unleash his quirk. A powerful explosion echoed through the area, sending a shockwave that knocked his friends back against a distant wall. Yet, the mud villain remained unscathed, still holding on to him. Bakugu twisted and writhed, creating more explosions that drew the attention of distant bystanders. The blasts ignited nearby gas tanks, resulting in a massive explosion that shattered the ground and walls of the surrounding buildings. Flames quickly spread across the area, igniting panic among the citizens. People fled in terror, while others watched from a safe distance, hesitant to help beyond calling the police. Authorities arrived swiftly, including heroes like Death Arms, who aimed to confront the villain, and Backdraft, who worked to extinguish the flames. Kamui Woods assisted civilians trapped in the fire, ensuring their safety. Death Arms approached the mud villain, only for his punch to sink into the villain's body. The villain retaliated, sending him flying into a wall, creating a crater. Backdraft attempted to douse the flames with water from his arm-mounted hoses, while Kamui helped Bakugu's friends and other civilians escape the inferno. Amidst the chaos, it was unclear if anyone had been injured by the fire. The mud villain shouted at the crowd to stay back while holding Bakugo captive. Bakugo struggled, trying to break free from the villain's grasp. He leaned forward, but after a few moments, he collapsed to his knees. "I won't let this filth consume me," he shouted desperately, unleashing more explosions from his hands. The force pushed back the heroes, the sound reverberating in their ears. The mud villain regenerated after half of his face was destroyed by Bakugo's quirk, still grinning with superiority. It seemed he had hit the jackpot. With a power like that of the boy, he could defeat all those foolish heroes after absorbing him. As the tension in the atmosphere grew, the citizens could only watch in horror as the boy was gradually consumed by the grotesque villain. The other heroes focused on evacuating people from the flames and extinguishing the fire, but their abilities were ineffective against the mud villain. Without mentioning that he had taken Bakugo hostage, it meant they could harm the boy if they tried to strike the villain. They had to wait for another hero to arrive. However, it was a race against time, and they were uncertain how long Kaken could endure before being absorbed. Everything seemed lost and hopeless as the heroes could only wait for help. The mud villain was just minutes away from absorbing that boy and taking control of his body, merging with him. He couldn't help but smile at the thought of seeing the faces of that boy's family when he had complete control over his vessel. On top of a building, a boy with curly hair and a fringe covering half of his right eye watched thoughtfully, pondering what to do. There were many heroes, but none seemed capable of helping Bakugo. Although Midoriya hesitated, he was certain that no one deserved to die at the hands of scum like that. Perhaps it was a bit hasty to attack the mud villain, even if it could affect Kaken, but they had to take risks to win. Izuku brought his palms together, crossing his thumbs and spreading his fingers to form the shape of a bird. He focused intently on the villain. Midoriya leaped from the rooftop, caught by the bird he summoned, which swooped down to drop him near the shattered ground before soaring back into the sky with a roar. After Nu momentarily paralyzed the villain with its lightning, Midoriya approached, plunging both hands into the mud that encased the criminal, trying to feel for Bakugo and force him out of his prison. The living mound of mud opened its eyes after recovering from the shock and looked down, realizing the boy was trying to pull his hostage from within. The villain raised his fist, ready to finish off the boy who dared to challenge him. The green-haired boy glanced at the villain before dodging backward, narrowly avoiding an attack that shattered part of the floor once more. The mud villain looked up in surprise after a few moments, finding that a gigantic frog had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, using its long tongue to pull the boy away from danger. Midoriya took a moment to glance at the mud villain, who glared at him with hatred, but he paid it no mind. He then spoke a few words before continuing the fight, which the heroes watched in astonishment at the sudden appearance of the boy. The long-awaited day had begun. Izuku had one last day of anticipation before the entrance exam and had prepared well. He woke up early to hide his sword along with some throwing knives, concealing them in his shadow alongside other gadgets like the clothes he would wear for the practical part of the exam. He had also trained his Shikigami dogs to track scents or detect enemies, whether in their totality form or neutral. After a moment, the boy left his room, first heading to the kitchen to prepare some coffee and toast sweetened with honey. He wrote a note that said he didn't want to wake anyone and that he would return later to share how the exam went. He then quietly went upstairs to his mother's room, leaving her breakfast by her nightstand. Izuku smiled at her for a moment before heading back downstairs, grabbing his backpack and setting off toward the unknown challenge. On his way, Izuku was headed to Dagoba, where he had been clearing a significant amount of trash over the past 10 months, leaving almost enough space to continue training. After walking for a while, he arrived, treading on the sand as his shoes sank slightly into it while he looked around to ensure no one was nearby. This struck him as odd since the strange skeletal man with blonde hair usually showed up when Izuku came every week. He wondered if it was because the entrance exam was the next day, but he dismissed it as irrelevant for the moment. He set his backpack down and then joined his hands, forming the first shape of his Shikigami. His shadow stretched out from behind him as he called upon one of his twin dogs, which manifested with a howl that echoed across the beach. The reason he only summoned one of his dogs was that he wanted to try something new. To manifest his dogs in their totality form, he usually needed both to be present or already summoned in that form. Izuku decided to attempt to make his white demon dog reach its totality form without its twin present. When he commanded it, the hound tilted its head in apparent confusion. Interestingly, Izuku's Shikigami obeyed his commands without question but also reacted to his thoughts and feelings. Sometimes, they sensed when he was sad, angry, or happy, which helped him maintain focus and avoid unintentionally deactivating his quirk. In the worst-case scenario, he could manifest all his Shikigami. Izuku's Shikigami were made of shadows, and when he deactivated his power, they returned to their original state in a puddle of darkness that flowed back into his shadow. At that moment, the jade dog was confused, not understanding what its master was trying to convey, so it simply lifted its paw in response. Midoriya rolled his eyes for a moment, realizing he couldn't make just one of his dogs achieve totality without its twin present. Sighing, he approached to pat the hound on the head and ordered it to return, causing it to disappear into a puddle of darkness. The boy felt somewhat disappointed but couldn't blame the animal, as it was his responsibility to teach his Shikigami new techniques. Sometimes, Izuku questioned whether he felt more comfortable with his spirits or if it was he who struggled to socialize with people. Perhaps if he weren't so intimidating he could make friends, but he didn't think it was that important. The doubt lingered in Izuku's mind as he contemplated whether someone would take the first step to initiate a conversation with him or if he should take a leap of faith himself. Izuku sat on the clean sand of the beach, holding a lock of his green hair that fell over the right side of his face. At that moment, he yearned to grow stronger on his own, alongside his Shikigamis that were part of his quirk. However, he also felt that if he wanted to be a hero, he needed to build relationships with others, which made him question his social skills. He understood that solitude was not beneficial for anyone, and he tried not to dwell on that fact. After a moment, Izuku stood up and threw a few punches into the air as a warm-up. He then summoned his sword from the shadows and made several swift cuts through the large pile of trash he had been collecting over the months, easily slicing through the debris. After several hours of training at a steady but accelerated pace, Midoriya focused on enhancing his physical abilities to endure longer during the practical part of the entrance exam. He also worked with one of his Shikigamis to see how long he could maintain the summoning before tiring. Izuku discovered a weakness in his quirk. While he could summon multiple Shikigamis at once, using his more powerful ones was exhausting. It was challenging to keep them summoned without physically wearing himself out. The more Shikigamis he summoned, the more energy he expended, risking fainting if he wasn't careful during critical situations. After training and dismissing his second and third Shikigamis, he left the beach, grabbing his backpack while stretching his arms, feeling a bit fatigued. He had certainly pushed himself harder than usual. As he walked through the streets toward home, curiosity led him to a small vending machine. He inserted a coin and received a candy bar wrapped in red. He opened it and began to enjoy the treat, savoring the moment. He thought to himself that it seemed like a peaceful day. After a few minutes, he reached the street where he lived and turned a corner. Noticing a familiar figure leaning against the wall beside his home, he squinted against the setting sun to see who it was. It was Kaken. The spiky-haired boy looked startled by Izuku's presence and avoided making direct eye contact. Izuku felt confused as he didn't remember inviting Kaken over, especially since it had been a long time since they had decided to meet at his house. They exchanged silent glances while Kaken kept his gaze lowered. Izuku watched him with curiosity, allowing him the time to speak. Kaken clenched his fists, recalling the events from 2 weeks prior when a mud villain had attacked, and Deku had jumped in to save him. Kaken exclaimed that he never asked for help, insisting he was fine on his own. He accused Izuku of wanting him to owe a favor for his assistance, demanding to know if that was true. At home, another teenager with freckles rested after returning from UA Academy. He sat with his jade dogs at the foot of his bed, drinking water and reading a book. Following the entrance exam, the results were announced, showcasing Izuku's impressive score of 110 points after defeating numerous robots and earning additional points for rescuing students in trouble. Surprisingly, professional heroes also took note of the heroic actions of some students who helped their classmates. Izuku received a strange letter that turned out to be a device projecting the image of All Might, who congratulated him for placing first in the entrance exam with a score that nearly surpassed his own from his debut at UA. After the hologram ended, Izuku felt satisfied with his results, though he hoped not to gain too much popularity for saving that girl from the zero-pointer, even though he felt it was justified since he had instructed Cabal to take her to safety. Izuku understood what his Shikigamis were trying to convey. His ability to summon them was not as simple as just materializing a shadow spirit. He had to first visualize the form in his mind and then bring it to life through darkness. He needed to think about the shape, color, and attributes it would represent. Moreover, each time he summoned a Shikigami, he had to purify it or defeat it in battle before it would obey him. Initially, it was quite challenging for Izuku to manifest the forms of his Shikigamis. He sketched various designs in his notebooks, discarding those he didn't like by crumpling the paper and tossing it aside. His first Shikigamis, the Jade Dogs, manifested when he felt threatened during a childhood fight with Kaken and his friends. As he grew, the green-haired boy managed to summon more Shikigami from his arsenal, reaching a total of 6. These Shikigami were quite versatile, some more powerful than others. However, the teenager had no complaints, as using stronger Shikigami required a lot of energy. After pondering his thoughts, Izuku got out of bed and walked to his desk while his dogs rested peacefully on the bed. He searched through the drawers for a notebook where he was designing his hero costume. There was a specific company that designed costumes for aspiring heroes who managed to get into UA, helping to maximize their abilities to their fullest potential. Izuku was unsure about how he wanted his costume to look, as he always thought of something simple, not too extravagant or colorful. Since he could carry his weapons in his shadow, he didn't necessarily need a special costume to hold them. Moreover, he usually didn't stand out for his physical strength but rather for his skill, ingenuity, and affinity with swords and other weapons like throwing knives, which were effective against larger and stronger enemies. However, Midoriya thought he should leave the heavier work to his stronger Shikigami, like Nu, Gamma, Orochi, or the totality form of his first Shikigami. The green-haired boy didn't want to fall behind due to his spirits protecting him. The mere thought of one of his Shikigami being defeated without him being able to do anything to stop the enemy made him feel worse, knowing he would be useless for not preventing his spirit's destruction. Izuku always found it more pleasant to talk with his Shikigami, as it wasn't until he awakened his quirk that he suffered from various taunts, punches, or simply being left out because he was considered abnormal for not having a quirk in this world or his class at that time. The only ones who truly understood him were his Shikigami and his mother, whom he always thanked for being by his side. This made him more gentle with those he appreciated, respected, or valued, and he would never forgive himself if one of his Shikigami were to die because of him, just like a loved one. Perhaps it was also due to the nature of Midoriya's quirk that he was so protective or careful with his spirits, but even Deku himself believed it was okay to worry about what he thought was right. He sighed, realizing he had become sentimental, and put his notebook back on the desk, thinking about how his mother wouldn't return until after midnight and that he would start his first day at UA the next day. Midoriya walked to his window and opened the curtains slightly to observe the outside of his home. The night was adorned with stars illuminating the dark sky under the moonlight. The green-haired boy felt a moment of tranquility that made him close his eyes for a second. After a few moments, he felt something on his hand, noticing that his white jade dog had approached him to lick his fingers and snuggled against his hand while he petted it. He expressed gratitude for their help during the exam, promising to reward them for ensuring that a certain girl was safe. He then made his way back to bed, suggesting it was time to sleep since the next day would likely be long. He lay under the covers, signaling for his dogs to lie down as well. Shiro and Kuro obeyed, settling beside Izuku to rest. The entire home was silent, filled only with the breathing of the two dogs and the heartbeat of Midoriya. The green-haired boy enjoyed moments like this, a peaceful time akin to a quiet chat or a nap before the chaos of the supernatural world he lived in began. Finally, he closed his eyes, drifting off to sleep alongside his Shikigami, who remained alert on either side of him to ensure no danger would interrupt the beautiful silence. At UA Academy, the green-haired boy known as Deku had risen from his bed hours earlier to head to the most prestigious academy in the country, which had an admission rate of less than 1 in 300. Not to mention, only 4 students were admitted by recommendation, with just 36 accepted through the entrance exams, divided into 2 groups of 18 students. Izuku felt relieved to have read the UA manual beforehand, which made him feel a bit more prepared. After taking a bus and walking through a few streets, he found himself strolling through the hallways of the prestigious academy, searching for Class 1A. He noticed the classroom a few hallways ahead, and as he approached, he saw the gigantic door leading inside. He paused for a moment, analyzing the entrance. Taking a deep breath, he steadied his gaze and calmly turned the doorknob. Midoriya truly hoped he wouldn't have to share a class with 2 particular students, Kaken and Tenya Lida. But upon opening the door, he was greeted by chaos. A blue-haired boy with glasses scolded a light-haired boy for putting his feet on the desk, demanding to know what his problem was. The light-haired boy, with a menacing smile, warned him to leave him alone or he would retaliate. Izuku stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, letting out a deep sigh and lowering his head, feeling the weight of his bad luck for sharing a class with those 2. Was it a coincidence or what many called fate? For the green-haired boy, it felt more like misfortune. The blue-haired boy confronted the light-haired one again, questioning his attitude toward a classmate. He introduced himself as Tenya Lida from Sumai Academy while both adolescents exchanged glances. Bakugo let out a small huff, rolling his eyes before returning his disinterested gaze to the student from Sumai. This means that if I crush you in training, I'll gain more popularity, right? You better not provoke me if you know what's good for you, he warned, raising his hands slightly and creating a small explosion. Tenya stepped back a little while other students, alongside Midoriya, observed the conflict between the 2. Midoriya, tired of waiting at the door, sighed and entered the classroom, checking his phone to see which seat he had been assigned. As he did so, he noticed the curious gazes of his classmates, but it seemed they still did not recognize him as the one who defeated the 0-pointer and topped the entrance exam. Not paying much attention to the stares, he settled into a seat by the window, calmly returning to his phone while remaining aware of his surroundings in case something caught his attention. In a seat at the back corner of the classroom sat a girl with a round face and shoulder-length brown hair. She watched the boy who had just entered, the one with curly hair, who seemed to be the same candidate who saved her during the urban combat in the entrance exam before she was nearly crushed by that giant robot. However, she wasn't entirely sure, as she didn't fully recognize him. She wanted to thank him, but at the same time, she felt somewhat intimidated. Her classmates also seemed to distance themselves from the green-haired boy, perhaps due to his gloomy appearance or a strange sense of alertness that enveloped them like a dense, dark fog. In another seat at the upper right corner of the classroom sat another girl who had attended middle school with Midoriya. He recognized her by her two-toned hair and the burn scar on the right side of her face. From a distance, she caught sight of the green-haired boy's hair. Todoroki was reading a book titled, A Tale of Two Cities, by a foreign author but paused when he heard the door open, quickly identifying the figure of the strange boy he had seen for the first time at UA's entrance the day after the entrance exam. He had passed by when he was going to speak with Principal Nizu about the recommendation from his father for admission. After failing to persuade the principal to let him take the exam, he decided to stay and observe the performance of the other hero candidates, finding Midoriya demonstrating his skills during the exam. Shoto was quite surprised to see how Izuku dismantled robots with his combat style, in addition to fighting those spirits he referred to as Shikigamis. Although he hadn't participated, he imagined that Midoriya would have ranked first in the exam based on what he saw on the leaderboard. She was even more surprised when she saw they would be in the same class and tried to anticipate how capable that strange green-haired boy would be when he showcased his abilities in the tests. It wasn't that she felt threatened by Midoriya's quirk, she just wanted to be prepared in case she had to face him. How interesting, she thought, observing the boy. After a few minutes, the door to classroom 1A opened, revealing a figure wrapped in a yellow sleeping bag. The students were unsure how to react at first, watching the peculiar human caterpillar enter the classroom, still wrapped in his sleeping bag. Through the fabric, they could see a tired male face with dark circles, messy long hair, and eyes that reflected a laziness akin to a capital sin. It took you 9 minutes to quiet down after I entered the classroom, A serious and somewhat tired voice spoke as a man emerged from the sleeping bag. His attire was black, with strange bandages wrapped around his neck. Well, I was told I should introduce myself. My name is Aizawa, and I will be your teacher for Class 1A. So until then, you are my responsibility, he informed them while stretching his neck slightly. The students looked at their teacher with a mix of curiosity and intrigue. They had never seen a professional hero so relaxed, to the point of not leaving his sleeping bag, and none recognized what professional hero he could be, except for Deku, who recalled a description from an article about underground heroes. His teacher was Shota Aizawa, better known as Eraserhead. The article described how this hero enjoyed taking naps and wearing loose clothing, and how sometimes the public mistook him for a homeless person. Izuku rested his elbow on the table, chin in hand, as he watched his teacher. Aizawa observed the class for a moment before lifting his sleeping bag and searching for something inside. I know this is sudden, he said, pulling out a couple of sports uniforms, blue and red with white accents. But, put these on and head to Beta Field. I will give you more explanations when we arrive. The students felt even more intrigued and somewhat excited at the thought of receiving hero training. The difference was that they were about to discover what kind of teacher Aizawa-sensei truly was. The students took the uniforms in their sizes, whether male or female, and then headed to the changing rooms. As Izuku walked through the hallways, he noticed two people who caught his attention. The girl he thought was named Ochako Uraraka and Todoroki-kun, whom he already knew from middle school. Both seemed attentive to him, but he pretended not to notice. The boy was unsure whether talking to either of them was the best option. He wanted to greet Todoroki first but hesitated, as he found it a bit challenging to speak with her since he didn't know her well. On the other hand, he wasn't sure if he should approach Uraraka after having saved her the day before in the exam. He admitted she seemed kind, but he could also see that she appeared somewhat nervous, perhaps due to the upcoming tests or some other reason he didn't know. Izuku sighed as he grabbed his uniform and headed into the boys' locker room alongside his classmates. Inside, some boys were murmuring their theories about what their teacher's training would entail. The teacher had a serious demeanor and a deep gaze, which made some students nervous, as they didn't fully trust their abilities. However, others, like Bakugu and Kirishima, seemed more confident. Kirishima had even suggested that this was some sort of manly test. Izuku, on the other hand, had stepped away from his classmates to avoid their gazes on his body, which bore scars he had kept hidden for years. He didn't want to deal with the inevitable questions that would arise. No one but Izuku had seen his scars, not even his mother, as he had concealed them since childhood while summoning and purifying more of his shikigamis for his arsenal. Each spirit he summoned became more intense, and he had successfully mastered 6 of them. He knew that summoning a 7th, 8th, or 9th would be much more challenging. Deep in thought, he didn't notice when a small boy with purple spheres on his head approached him, astonished by the scars covering his body. The boy exclaimed in shock, pointing at Izuku, which made Izuku think to himself how foolish the boy was. The other students quickly gathered around, curious about the commotion. Some were still in their uniforms, while others had changed into their sports gear. They noticed Minetta's astonishment directed at Izuku and quickly understood the reason for his surprise. The numerous scars that marred Izuku's skin, each telling a story of past battles, claw marks, cuts, bites, and burns covering his torso and legs. One of the boys, with sharp teeth, asked who had done that to him. Izuku realized that his classmates wouldn't let the matter drop until he answered. He decided to give them a look that conveyed a hint of the darkness within him, which surprised and frightened them. They quickly returned to their previous activities, leaving Izuku to change in peace. After a few minutes, both boys and girls exited the locker room to head to Beta Field, where Aizawa-sensei awaited them in a large testing area. The scene reminded Izuku of the baseball field at his old school, a place he used to visit to relax. Eraserhead let out a soft sigh and stopped checking his phone. He noted that they had taken almost 10 minutes but decided to overlook it since they had arrived on time. He informed them that at UA, teachers could educate their students as they saw fit, and there was no time for activities that wasted valuable moments in his curriculum. He explained that what was about to happen would be like a Quirk exam, similar to physical tests from elementary school, but complemented by their abilities. He displayed a list of the tests on his phone. Eraserhead then pulled a smooth metal ball from his pocket and showed it to the students. He announced that the first student would demonstrate how the Quirk exam would work. Bakugu let out a small laugh, puffing out his chest with pride, and stepped forward. He asked Izuku what his record for throwing a ball was in middle school. Izuku calmly replied that it was 70 meters as he walked to the front and took the ball in his left hand. Bakuga's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected Deku to be the one to take the lead in the exam. Other students from Class 1A also felt confused, realizing that the boy who had topped the rankings in the urban combat test had also defeated the top scorer, achieving a score nearly as high as All Might's from years ago during his entrance exam to UA. Uraraka finally recognized Izuku as the one who had saved her from that large simulated villain. She thought about thanking him but decided to stay still, knowing it wasn't the right moment. Todoroki noticed Uraraka's restlessness but chose to focus on Midoriya, curious about what he would do. He encouraged Izuku to do his best, reminding him to stay within the circle. Midoriya nodded in response, ignoring the murmurs from his classmates as he positioned himself in the circle. He knew that if he threw the ball with all his strength, he would only reach 80 meters at most. If he used Nu, he might reach 200 or even 500 meters if the owl flew from the UA limits, but he dismissed that option for safety reasons. After a brief moment, Izuku came up with a better idea. He knelt down in the circle, extending a small pool of shadow beneath him, using the sunlight behind him to his advantage. Both the teacher and his classmates were once again surprised as they watched him place the ball behind the pool of darkness until it disappeared from view. Todoroki felt a mix of surprise and intrigue as he realized he was unaware of Midoriya's Quirk capabilities. Aizawa, curious about what his student had done, glanced at his phone to check the distance the ball had traveled into the darkness. The numbers on Aizawa's phone fluctuated wildly, beeping with urgency. Eraser, confused by the situation, attempted to fix it but had to drop the phone when it began to overheat and then exploded. Aizawa murmured in confusion, wondering what had just happened. Meanwhile, Izuku managed a small, almost imperceptible smile, pleased with his unexpected display of power. He had no idea what his quirk truly was or where the ball had gone, but it felt like something far beyond this realm of existence. Moments later, he retrieved the ball from his shadow and handed it back to his teacher. Aizawa examined the ball and then looked at Midoriya, noticing no change in either the object or the boy. His curiosity about what Midoriya had done, which All Might had discussed with the principal recently, lingered, but he decided to set it aside for now. Bakugu, filled with frustration, demanded to know how Midoriya had accomplished that feat as he approached him aggressively. Just as Bakugu got closer, his quirk malfunctioned, and strange bands shot out, entangling his legs. He struggled to free himself but only became more ensnared. Aizawa warned him in a threatening tone, his red eyes glaring and hair spiked. He made it clear that attacking classmates was not heroic behavior, and if Bakugu attempted anything like that again, he would face expulsion. Aizawa released him, watching as Bakugu growled in annoyance before returning to his spot. Izuku also returned to his place, passing by Aizawa without giving much thought to the earlier incident. Aizawa sighed and decided to continue the tests, hoping his students would shake off their surprise and focus. One by one, the students took turns throwing the ball with all their might, showcasing impressive abilities. Among the standout performers were Izuku, Bakugu, Todoroki, Momo, Uraraka, Tokoyami, and Jairu, the girl with headphones. While some excelled more than others, the ball toss was merely the foundation of the first exercise. Everyone performed well except for one boy, the one who had first noticed Midoriya's scars in the locker room. After the ball toss, Aizawa instructed the students to prepare for a 50-meter race using their quirks. Excitement filled the air as they anticipated the chance to utilize their powers in an educational setting. Izuku had analyzed the short track and considered using one of his Shikigami to easily win, but he recognized that this exercise was about practicing their quirks and exploring their limits. He was determined to discover more about his own abilities while also focusing on victory. A girl with pink hair and yellow antennae, Ashido, expressed her excitement about using their quirks, suggesting it would be fun. Aizawa abruptly halted, turning to his students with a more serious demeanor. They had already destroyed his phone, but he wasn't looking for revenge, he wanted to broaden their perspective. He asked them if they thought it was fun, and with a slight smile, he challenged them to make it more interesting. He reminded them that they only had 3 years to become professional heroes and needed to act with greater seriousness. He then announced that the last student in the 8 physical tests would be considered without potential and expelled from UA. The students were taken aback, some in disbelief, thinking it was a joke. Many voiced their complaints about the unfairness of being expelled for not finishing in the top ranks, but Aizawa stood firm. He made it clear that if they wanted to remain at UA, they would have to prove themselves. The only condition he had requested when becoming a teacher was the authority to expel those he deemed without potential, ensuring they wouldn't fall into the hands of villains in the future. The first race began when Aizawa commanded silence among the students and organized them into pairs for the second exercise. He led them to a different area where Bakugo and Midoriya were positioned in the first 2 lanes of the 50-meter track. Midoriya could almost smell the sweet scent of nitroglycerin from being so close to his former friend. Despite the looming threat of expulsion, Izuku remained focused on testing the various capabilities of his quirk to enhance his creativity. However, he was reluctant to reveal all his tricks to his classmates or even to Aizawa, so he decided not to use his Shikigami unless absolutely necessary. The race commenced when a robot serving as a starting signal turned green. Bakugo propelled himself forward, hands behind his back, using his explosions to simulate flight, though he was really just boosting himself with his quirk. Izuku reacted quickly, starting to run as well. He took a small leap forward, and after just 3 steps, he extended his shadow beneath him like a viscous liquid, allowing him to glide swiftly across the ground. He reached the end of the track 2 seconds ahead of Bakugo, finishing with a time of 8.01 seconds. Bakugo stood momentarily stunned, gritting his teeth in frustration as he landed on the ground. He glared at Deku, his eyes filled with annoyance. Once the race ended, the green-haired boy let his shadow dissolve beneath him. The second exercise had left him somewhat uncertain, as he realized that when he used his shadow in its liquid form, like a sort of skateboard, he needed to maintain a constant density within the dark puddle to prevent it from dissolving and to ensure it could support his movement. As Izuku pondered this, Bakugo's irritation grew since he felt ignored. Eraserhead had to separate the 2 boys from the 8 exercises due to the sharp tension between them, accompanied by the explosive energy radiating from Bakugo. He knew they didn't need any injuries at that moment. There were several standout students, each with potential to grow, discover, and expand their quirks as they evolved over time. Many of them would undoubtedly become great professional heroes in due course. It seemed that Eraserhead's little motivational joke served as a good incentive to push them to their limits. For instance, Tenya Lida, the brother of Ingenium, was inspired to become a hero. He was someone who approached situations with precision and care, analyzing them thoroughly to find the best solution. His quirk granted him great speed depending on his surroundings, and he used his sharp intellect acquired at Sumai to move forward. However, his main flaw was his strict adherence to rules, which could hinder his ability to adapt to unforeseen situations. Ochako Uraraka was a kind-hearted girl who cared for others and focused on excelling in her tests using her quirk and ingenuity. While she had a strong spirit, she still needed to improve her physical capabilities and the endurance of her quirk, particularly regarding how much weight she could lift and how long she could maintain her powers without feeling nauseous or fainting. She was determined to achieve her dream and had great potential for growth. Momo Yaoyorozu was one of the students who gained admission to UA through her wealthy family's recommendation. She had undergone dedicated training to master her quirk and was known for her intelligence and adaptability in various situations. Her versatility in combat with weapons was impressive. However, her main weakness was her difficulty in interacting with her peers in a less formal manner, which could pose challenges in the future when it came to teamwork. Katsuki Bakugo was a boy with a strong temperament and immense pride. His sense of superiority was backed by his highly destructive quirk. The explosive blonde adapted quickly to the various exercises, effectively utilizing his powers in different situations and demonstrating a knack for strategic thinking. His main drawback was similar to Yaoyorozu's. He struggled to communicate with others without resorting to mockery or threats, preferring to work alone rather than in a team. Shoto Todoroki, the daughter of the number 2 hero, had undergone training from a young age, making her more skilled than most of her peers. She possessed great physical endurance thanks to her versatile quirk, allowing her to excel in the first 2 exercises with relative ease. She even matched the explosive boy's score, suggesting their abilities were somewhat equal, although she had only used her ice side throughout the tests. Izuku Midoriya was simply extraordinary. This young man displayed physical abilities surpassing those of an average middle school student, and his proficiency with weapons, combined with his quirk, made him stand out in the practical exam. His quirk, known as the 10 Shadows, allowed him to manifest spirits that served as allies in battle. He demonstrated excellent teamwork with them to overcome the challenges presented. Additionally, he managed to engulf a titanium ball within what appeared to be his shadow, causing the device tracking his movements to malfunction. Remarkably, he did not use any of his shikigami in the 8 tests, cleverly relying on his shadow to navigate obstacles. There was something intriguing about him. He seemed to exude an aura reminiscent of a predator circling its prey, which made some of his classmates hesitant to approach him, perhaps intimidated or fearful, though he appeared unaware of this effect. Perhaps it didn't matter too much to him, one way or another. As Aizawa noted the students' performances in his notebook, someone partially hidden, characterized by a broad smile and impressive musculature, had been observing how Eraserhead directed the students. He had heard about Aizawa's distinctive method of expelling the student with the lowest score, justifying it by claiming they lacked potential. While he initially thought it was a trick or a joke meant to motivate his students, he also knew that Aizawa had expelled the entire class 2A the previous year for not having what it took to be heroes. However, that wasn't the main reason he had come to observe Class 1A. Instead, he was analyzing which of these young individuals could potentially be the 9th bearer of One for All, depending on the results displayed by each boy and girl he watched. His best option remained the young Midoriya, but he wasn't entirely sure due to the almost intimidating aura surrounding the boy, so he wouldn't limit himself to just one choice and would continue observing the other students. Bakugo and Todoroki appeared to be among the most capable, alongside Midoriya, making them strong contenders. This decision would not be taken lightly and would require considerable time. A lot of time. After completing the 8 exercises, Eraserhead pressed a button, causing a hologram to appear above him displaying the results. The top 3 were Izuku, Todoroki, and Bakugo, the latter of whom clenched his teeth in frustration, never expecting to place 3rd and refusing to accept it. He knew he hadn't used all his strength due to the limitations of the simple physical education exercises, and his pride had taken a hit. Midoriya smiled slightly as he saw himself in 1st place again, feeling a sense of gratification, knowing that he wouldn't be expelled from UA since he had managed to surpass each test without revealing any of his shikigami, at least not in a way that his classmates or Aizawa-sensei would notice. Todoroki glanced at the green-haired boy, who seemed satisfied with his result, but she wasn't quite sure how to feel. Perhaps she was relieved that she wouldn't be expelled, but she also noticed that Midoriya seemed to have been holding back during the exercises. She hadn't seen him use his white or black dogs, although she assumed he didn't mind too much. In theory, all the students who saw their positions at the end of the ranking felt a mix of frustration, anxiety, and disappointment. Among them were Toru, Koda, and Mineta, who felt overshadowed by their stronger classmates. Mineta was on the verge of tears, ready to plead for mercy. However, Eraserhead's voice stopped them. The expulsion was a lie, he said, running a hand through his hair and pushing it back. It was just a trick to encourage you all to give your best. He offered a slight smile as he watched the 3 students go blank for a moment. A sigh escaped among the students, particularly from the girl with the creation quirk. Of course it was a trick. If you think about it, they wouldn't expel us on the first day, she argued in her serious tone while stretching her arms slightly. Several students murmured among themselves. Some seemed unfazed, while others, like Tenya Ida, reproached their teacher for motivating them with falsehoods. This struck some of the Class 1A students as amusing, while others collapsed to the ground, exhausted from the intensity and tension of their first day at UA. Aizawa began to leave, reminding his students that copies of the syllabus were available in the classroom, encouraging them to pick one up during their free time. Izuku ran a hand through his soft, curly hair, feeling a manageable level of fatigue. He shrugged off the small trick his teacher had played as he walked and noticed a figure partially hidden in a yellow suit, a tall man who seemed to be leaving. Out of curiosity, he would have liked to ask who he was or if he was an intruder gathering information about him and his class. However, before he could walk toward the man, he felt a hand on his shoulder, prompting him to turn around. "Oh, hello. Uraraka-san," he said calmly as he turned to face her. The girl nodded in response to his greeting, taking a moment to observe the boy who had saved her, wanting to thank him but struggling to find the right words at first. Standing close to Midoriya, she realized he was nearly her height, perhaps only 10 centimeters taller, as she stood at 1.56 meters and he at around 1. She fell silent for several seconds, feeling nervous for reasons she couldn't quite understand. Being near the green-haired boy wasn't suffocating, but his dark green eyes seemed to draw her in, making her sweat slightly under the pressure of his gaze. She scratched the back of her neck, averting her eyes. Midoriya tilted his head slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, observing her closely, unsure of why she was acting this way. Uraraka avoided eye contact and nodded her head. "Why yeah, I just wanted to." She glanced at him again, and an idea struck her, a truth disguised as a compliment. "I wanted to congratulate you on coming in first in the exercises we did. It's great that Aizawa-sensei didn't expel any of us after all." She offered a small smile before looking into his eyes for a moment. Midoriya stared at Uraraka for a second before nodding in response. As soon as the girl saw that he acknowledged her somewhat awkward compliment, she gave a small bow and hurried away toward her classroom. Izuku stood in silence for a moment, analyzing the girl's behavior after the exam, unsure of what to think. He assumed she was still nervous about meeting them or something similar, but he ultimately didn't dwell on it as he made his way to his classroom as well. It had been a long day, but there was still the anticipation of what awaited in class the next day. Izuku walked out of UA Academy after finishing Professor Aizawa's class. It had been an entertaining day for many, filled with unexpected surprises, though also somewhat exhausting. The green-haired boy strolled calmly with his hands in his pockets, oblivious to his surroundings but alert for anyone approaching, like Ochako Uraraka, who seemed to act nervously around him. He had an inkling of why that might be, though he wasn't entirely sure. He suspected that his presence or aura intimidated Uraraka, just as it did with some of his classmates, causing them to keep their distance. Izuku never intended to be frightening. In fact, he didn't want to be at all. However, it felt as if his quirk emitted a dangerous aura to those who didn't know him, making their instincts urge them to stay away for their own safety. It was strange how his quirk seemed to have darkened his gaze over the years. As a child, he had always had a certain sparkle in his eyes that only his mother or Bakugo would have noticed. However, it had been a long time since he felt that way. Perhaps the years of bullying had shaped his current personality. He often felt lonely because he struggled to trust people who approached him and his life. He believed that every action or emotion had another side. This fear of forming attachments only to have them betray his trust again weighed heavily on him. Since his father left and never returned, Izuku had faced trust issues with other children, which his mother helped him overcome. Yet, deep down, he still found it difficult to fully trust what people said or how they interacted with him. He was always wary, fearing that if he grew close to certain individuals, they might eventually leave his life, breaking his trust once more. Shaking off these thoughts, he decided to wander the city for a while. He had no rush since his mother hadn't messaged him about coming home early. As the sun began to set, he strolled through Mizudafu, feeling a sense of freedom. Izuku walked aimlessly through the streets, lost in thought with his gaze fixed on the horizon. After a while, he chose to sit on a bench in a nearby park, enjoying the sunset and the sky painted in shades of red as the sun descended. Families filled the park, some with children, others with friends or relatives, which prompted a faint sigh of nostalgia from him. He recalled how, as a child, he would visit the park almost daily with his mother, Kaken, and Mitsuri-san, Bakugo's mother, to play together, which had been so much fun. He remembered his childhood love for animals. When he manifested his jade dogs, he finally experienced what it was like to have a pet, or rather, a spirit. However, he never had many friends to share his beloved pet with. While it might sound a bit immature, it was natural for a child to want to show off their white hound. But that didn't matter much to Izuku anymore. He believed it was irrelevant to dwell on those past moments after so many years. They were just good memories. It was a pity that he and Bakugo were no longer friends, considering how well they had gotten along since childhood. Neither of them could quite explain why they had stopped talking, but Izuku assumed that time changes people. He thought to himself that one reaps what one sows. He had come to clear his mind, yet he found himself feeling more frustrated than before. Closing his eyes for a moment and lowering his head, he realized he had spent too much time lost in thought. Noticing the sun was nearly gone, he decided to leave the park. Suddenly, he heard a small scream from a distance. Turning around, he saw a little girl with white hair and dark streaks, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, struggling with a much older man. Izuku thought someone would intervene, but there were hardly any people around, which surprised him. He felt compelled to step in. Before he could approach, he noticed another girl with short hair and red streaks, wearing glasses, stepping in to grab the man's arm, trying to stop him. Izuku recognized her as Todoroki's sister, who was either older or younger than him. She was attempting to make the man release the little girl. He noticed a resemblance between Fuyumi and the child, but he couldn't tell if they were related. The man they were struggling with wore a black coat and a large hat that obscured his face, towering over Fuyumi. He tried to convince her that the girl was his granddaughter and that he was taking her home, but she clearly didn't want to go. Fuyumi looked at the man with disdain and shook her head. She insisted that the girl, named Hana, was her cousin. She tried to gently pull the child away from him, but the man tightened his grip. Fuyumi winced in pain as she struggled against him. It was clear to Izuku that the man was a villain attempting to kidnap the little girl. He listened to their conversation from behind a tree, growing increasingly frustrated with the man who wouldn't let go of Fuyumi's arm as she demanded he release her. The green-haired boy, tired of waiting, intervened by stepping out of his hiding place and walking toward the scene that had formed in the afternoon light at the park. The man only then noticed the boy's presence, just as Fuyumi did, and both turned to look at him. The man, holding the girl's arm, asked who he was. Izuku shot him a piercing glare and ordered him to let go of her arm and leave. The man glanced at Izuku, noticing he was much shorter and possibly weaker, and scoffed at his words. He mockingly asked what if he said no while Fuyumi struggled against him. Izuku focused intently on the man before bringing his palms together, forming the shape of a hound. Calling forth his jade dogs, the boy's shadow stretched beneath his feet and to the sides, where 2 dark figures emerged from the shadows. 2 hound-like Shikigami appeared. Shiro, the white jade dog, howled upon being summoned, and both understood Izuku's intent. They turned their sharp gazes toward the man, growling menacingly. The man in the coat was startled by the sudden appearance of the dogs and released Fuyumi in surprise. She quickly moved to her cousin, who was watching from a distance, and was embraced by Todoroki's sister, pulling her away from the situation. To get a better view of the man and the boy who had appeared, Izuku kept his eyes fixed on the man, with his Shikigami growling at him as he slowly advanced. Even if a fight broke out, the villain thought he could win, but something about the boy felt off. His gaze was so dark that it seemed to draw in the light, which was unusual for any teenager these days, even in a world as supernatural as theirs. Izuku narrowed his eyes, making it clear that he wanted the man to leave his sight. The villain felt a chill run down his spine and took a step back, unable to break eye contact with the boy, who seemed to be surrounded by a dark mist. However, after a threatening bark from the black hound, the man turned and fled in fear. Seeing the man gone, Izuku relaxed his expression and turned to Fuyumi and the girl named Hana. He felt compelled to say something, so with a wave of his hand, he signaled for his dogs to calm down and stop growling at the spot where the man had been. He asked if they were all right, trying to sound friendly. Fuyumi jumped slightly, still holding Hana in her arms, and looked at Izuku, feeling that he seemed somewhat familiar, as if she had seen him before. She thanked him for his help, analyzing his appearance for a moment. Izuku noticed that Fuyumi bore a resemblance to Todoroki, with sharp features and fair skin, despite their differences in hair and eye color. He stared at her for a few seconds before shifting his gaze to the small girl in her arms. He wondered if she was Todoroki's cousin, noting how small she was before looking away. Fuyumi noticed Izuku's attention on Hana and pulled the girl closer, though Hana seemed more fascinated by the dogs than frightened. When Izuku realized he had been staring too long, he scratched the back of his neck, feeling a bit embarrassed. He apologized for bothering them and instructed his Shikigami to follow him as he began to walk away. Fuyumi decided to leave with her cousin, turning her back to the green-haired boy and putting the earlier conflict behind her. Just as she was about to walk away, she felt Hana wriggling in her arms. Using some of her strength, the girl managed to stand on her own and quickly walked toward Izuku. He stopped in his tracks, along with his dogs, as he noticed the girl behind him. Izuku looked at her, noting her school uniform and a large white hat that seemed too big for her head. They exchanged silent gazes, and even though he wanted to ask what she wanted, he held back as he saw her searching her pocket. She pulled out a small notebook and began to write something, then showed it to him. "Excuse me, sir, may I touch it?" After reading what the girl had written, Izuku saw her gazing at his Shikigami with interest and curiosity. It was easy for him to grant her request, so he nodded in affirmation. The girl approached Kuro, who obediently sat down at Izuku's command. Hana timidly reached out her small hand to gently touch the hound's fur, beginning to pet him. Fuyumi watched intently as her cousin interacted with the canine, noting how it liked her fingers. She also observed the boy who had summoned the dogs, finally recognizing him as the one she had encountered with her younger sister Shoto, where they had almost fought in broad daylight. She remembered how that giant wolf-like creature had nearly devoured her sister, but in the end, the boy with curly hair had simply apologized before leaving. Izuku Midoriya had heard Shoto mention a certain boy several times, describing him as someone familiar yet just a boy who had attended the same middle school as Fuyumi. Curiously, he was now in the same class as her sister at UA, which Izuku confirmed upon seeing Midoriya's uniform. Although he didn't fully trust Izuku Midoriya, he noticed a small, almost imperceptible smile on the boy's face as he observed how much fun his spirits were having with the little girl. Fuyumi, as expected, didn't fully trust someone she didn't know well, but she could tell he was a good person for having helped her, which made her smile a little too. She noticed how her cousin seemed to enjoy the company of the dogs that the boy had summoned. Izuku found himself lost in thought while watching his dogs play with the girl. He was intrigued by Shoto's family, as he didn't know them very well but was curious to learn more about them in time. He lifted his gaze after a moment and met Fuyumi's eyes. After a few minutes, the two had settled on a bench under the warm glow of the sunset, with Hana playing nearby with Izuku's dogs. They sat in respectful silence until Izuku decided to break it. He introduced himself, stating that his name was Izuku Midoriya and that it was a pleasure to meet her, bowing slightly as he glanced at her. Fuyumi quickly turned to him, offering a small smile in response. She introduced herself as Fuyumi Todoroki, asking him to call her Fuyumi. Izuku nodded, and an awkward silence fell between them as they both turned their attention back to the sunset, listening to Hana's laughter as she played in the grass behind them. Midoriya pondered a topic to ease the tension, hoping to make Fuyumi feel more comfortable having a stranger beside her. Once he found the right words, he spoke again, his tone serious but slightly softer. He apologized for what had happened that day, explaining that when he pulled her and her sister away from the road, it was to prevent a potential accident. He also expressed regret if he had frightened her, especially since his Shikigamis had nearly overwhelmed her sister and Shoto. Fuyumi looked at him, slightly confused by the term he used. Izuku clarified that Shikigamis were the dogs he had summoned that day, the same ones now playing with Hana. She listened attentively, glancing at him and sensing that he seemed like a good person. She hadn't expected him to bring up that day's events, but she raised a hand to indicate there was no problem. She reassured him that she held no grudges about that day and appreciated his manners. Fuyumi also apologized, acknowledging that her sister had acted impulsively and attacked him, even though he only wanted to help. Izuku didn't mind that Shoto had attacked him. Anyone could have reacted that way when caught off guard in the street. He nodded in affirmation, feeling that no further apologies were necessary. He took a moment to observe the girl beside him and then glanced at Hana playing with the dogs. He expressed his surprise at seeing her again, mentioning that he hadn't expected her to agree to talk with him. Fuyumi noticed the slight change in his gaze as he looked at her cousin. She had stepped out of her home to clear her mind from the ongoing issues within her family. She had taken her cousin, the daughter of her mother's brother, to enjoy some fresh air and escape the arguments between her father, Enji Todoroki, known as Endeavor, and her mother. Fuyumi and her siblings didn't know much about their mother's family, and that day, her uncle had brought his daughter to meet them. They had spent some relatively peaceful moments together, only for her uncle to later confront her father about visiting his sister, who was in a psychiatric ward. This confrontation had only added to the tension in their home. As Fuyumi drifted into her thoughts, she momentarily forgot everything around her, a change in her expression that Izuku noticed. He sensed a tension in her eyes, perhaps a desperation as she contemplated her situation. Deku was good at reading emotions, and he felt a connection to her feelings of loneliness and uncertainty. He understood that the Todoroki family environment might not be very pleasant. The freckled boy glanced at his white jade dog, who quickly noticed his gaze. While the black hound played with Hana, Izuku called the dog over with a thought. The canine jumped playfully, settling between them on the bench, successfully drawing Fuyumi's attention. Fuyumi looked confused as the white Shikigami sat beside her, glancing at Izuku, who simply nodded in response. Hesitant, she raised her hand to slide the Shikigami, and the dog nestled against her palm. As she ran her fingers through its soft white fur, she noticed Shiro inching closer to her. A gentle laugh escaped her lips, a sound she hadn't made in a long time. She was surprised by how comforting it felt to touch an animal, especially since she had never had a pet like her siblings. It was a pleasant experience nonetheless. Midoriya observed Fuyumi's expression as she petted her Shikigami, noticing how her demeanor gradually shifted. She was no longer as serious as he had seen her earlier. Instead, she seemed to finally have a moment to herself. This reminded him of the overwhelming feeling he experienced returning home from the beach, where he had to balance studying and training while also preparing meals for his mother. Whenever he felt stressed, his jade dogs would appear, providing companionship and lifting his spirits. Now, Midoriya understood why animals were so attuned to their owners, always reflecting the same desire for affection. He didn't know the specifics of what Fuyumi was going through, but he wanted to help ease her mind. He remarked that she looked happy and noted that it wasn't bad to take a moment for oneself. Fuyumi turned to him in surprise at his words but couldn't help but smile in understanding after a few seconds. As the eldest sibling, she always tried to set a good example for her brothers and create a positive atmosphere at home. However, living under the current circumstances was challenging, and she realized that despite her efforts to appear strong and cheerful, there were moments when she simply sought to relieve her stress without breaking down or crying in silence. After a brief pause, she nodded in response, looking at him. She expressed her gratitude, giving him a smile that was wider than before. Midoriya shook his head, insisting she shouldn't thank him, as he had merely helped clear her mind. It was the least he could do. He smiled gently once more before returning his gaze to the sunset. They both enjoyed the silence that followed their exchange of words. Izuku watched as Fuyumi and Hana engaged with their Shikigamis, feeling pleased that he could uplift others or help them forget their troubles without fear of the mysterious darkness surrounding him. Unlike before, he wasn't trying to earn Fuyumi's trust. He simply wanted to cheer her up after noticing a hint of sadness in her eyes. This was what a hero did, wasn't it? Izuku pondered how far he could go in helping someone in need or if he could truly free them from the abyss that was the world. After several minutes, Fuyumi stood up from the bench and approached Hana, who seemed to be getting sleepy as night fell. Izuku also rose, feeling a bit tired but not showing it. Maintaining his quirk in the form of his Shikigamis for an extended PRD was something he needed to work on, and it was exhausting. He stood with his usual expression so the girls would notice, and this outing felt like a quiet training session in a way. As they walked around the park, Izuku moved alongside Fuyumi, who was carrying a sleeping Hana, with their shikigamis keeping watch around them. The night was calm, the dark sky filled with stars millions of kilometers away. Izuku walked in silence beside Fuyumi, this time feeling more at ease as the tension seemed to have dissipated thanks to his earlier intervention. If asked, he would attribute some credit to Shiro and Kuro, as they had acted as mediators. Fuyumi turned her head slightly toward Midoriya, speaking calmly. She mentioned that she hadn't properly thanked him for helping her and Hana, adding that if Hana were awake, she would surely express her gratitude as well. She smiled softly at him before continuing to walk beside him. Midoriya followed her gaze, nodding quietly as he listened to her response. He assured her not to worry, stating that he had only done what anyone would have done. He spoke modestly, which Fuyumi noticed, prompting a soft laugh from her. She remarked that not everyone would go to such lengths when witnessing injustice. There was something in his eyes, she noted, claiming to be good at reading expressions. She paused, aligning her body to face him directly, explaining that his gaze resembled a vast emptiness or an abyss of darkness, as if he were alone in that depth, unsure of what to do. However, she had seen something different in his eyes moments ago. Izuku looked at her, slightly surprised, unsure how to respond to Fuyumi's observations. He was uncertain if she was speaking the truth or merely teasing him. She clarified that she wasn't joking, emphasizing that people often hide their emotions, but their eyes reveal their true feelings. She found it challenging to read his gaze, sensing that he might distrust others, which could prevent him from opening up to new experiences or trusting those around him. She glanced at Hana in her arms before continuing to speak to Izuku. For a moment, Izuku caught a glimpse in Fuyumi's eyes, as if it was easy for her to see others laugh and enjoy themselves. Thought that perhaps what she truly liked was knowing that even someone like her could bring smiles to others. She looked at him with a gentle smile. Izuku remained silent, his eyes slightly widened, surprised by Fuyumi's response. He pondered her words, wondering if someone like him could truly have that effect on others. After a brief pause, he noticed Fuyumi stepping closer, which made him hesitate in his thoughts. She suggested he give her an answer when he understood his own emotions. With a momentary glance, she lowered her head in a respectful farewell, hoping to see him again. She offered him one last smile before turning to leave. Izuku stood there, deep in thought about what Fuyumi had said, watching as she walked away while his shikigamis paused behind him. He turned to gaze at the night sky, which had darkened completely over the park. With a soft sigh, he adjusted his backpack on his shoulders and scratched his head, preparing to head home. He hoped Fuyumi wouldn't mention their conversation to Todoroki, as he felt a twinge of anxiety about how the Son of Endeavor would react to his sister speaking with him. At UA Academy, Izuku sat in his usual spot, focused on memorizing the curriculum for the hero course. While some classes, like English in the mornings, were necessary, they could be a bit dull for those who had high expectations for combat training and special moves with their quirks. However, not everything was as exciting as they hoped, and some students put in more effort than others to complete their assignments. Present Mike encouraged the class with a loud voice, urging them to wake up or he would pull their ears. He asked which of the sentences in English was incorrect. Izuku thought about the relative pronoun in the last sentence as he wrote his answer in his notebook, listening to another girl respond. As the first class PRD ended, the students stood up calmly when the bell rang for recess, packing their things. Izuku did the same and made his way to the cafeteria, knowing that UA had a gourmet menu at low prices, which piqued his interest. Just before leaving, he felt a gaze on his back. When he discreetly glanced over, he found Uraraka looking at him. She seemed lost in thought, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to approach him. Deciding to ignore it for now, he continued on his way to the cafeteria. However, it was Todoroki's persistent gaze that left Izuku feeling more unsettled. He tried to conceal his discomfort as he walked through the school hallways until he reached the cafeteria. There, he searched for an empty table and grabbed a tray of food, ordering katsudon and curry from a hero chef who was a robot. The hero noted his order and opened his abdomen to reveal the dishes inside. Izuku was unsure if that was the hero's quirk or just a mechanism, but he had no complaints as he thanked the robot for his meal. Joining his hands in gratitude, Izuku began to enjoy each bite, ignoring the fact that he was alone at his table. This moment reminded him of his childhood, bringing a small smile to his face as he recalled how his mother would prepare katsudon for them to share. As he savored his meal, he reflected on Fuyumi's words. She seemed to have a talent for reading emotions, and he found it curious that she had noticed the darkness in his gaze, which he sometimes struggled to see in himself. After taking another bite of katsudon, he rested his chin on his hand, feeling relaxed as he contemplated Fuyumi's insights. Eventually, Izuku finished both dishes and wiped his mouth with a napkin, feeling satisfied. He stood up to return to his classroom, but out of curiosity, he looked around to see if anything caught his attention. He noticed his classmates at a distant table, chatting and eating before they also got up to head back to class. Izuku felt indifferent as he observed them laughing, unsure of what to make of the students he didn't know well yet. He had memorized their names from the labels on their seats, but that was all. After leaving the cafeteria, he walked through the hallways until he reached classroom 1A. Upon entering, he opened the door calmly and recognized a familiar figure inside. Indeed, it was Todoroki who gazed out the window, oblivious to the happenings around him. However, when Midoriya entered the classroom, he turned to glance at him for a moment. The boy was unsure if Fuyumi had mentioned what had happened the previous day, but he decided not to dwell on it and walked to his seat normally, still feeling the girl's gaze on his back. Speaking of her, Todoroki briefly looked at Izuku's curly hair from his seat before returning his attention to the window. Gradually, the other students of Class 1A began to arrive, some accompanied by friends who chatted among themselves until they settled into their respective places. Lida, however, insisted that others sit properly and respect the desks when they did so. As Izuku listened to Lida discussing the importance of maintaining a formal attitude and sitting correctly, he also heard loud footsteps approaching from outside the classroom, prompting him to turn his gaze to see who it was. The large door swung open, and everyone turned to see if it was a teacher or someone else. A familiar voice announced its presence, and Deku recognized it instantly along with the rest of his classmates. All Might, the #1 hero, glided through the door, showcasing his radiant smile. He entered as if he were just another person, addressing the class with his characteristic grin that radiated confidence. The classroom buzzed with excitement. It was understandable since the greatest hero was standing before them as their teacher, set to conduct their basic hero training. Most of the students in Class 1A murmured among themselves, speculating about how All Might would train them, their excitement palpable. Izuku felt slightly annoyed by the noise and chatter of his classmates, even though he was also thrilled to see the #1 hero in person. He wished they would lower their voices as he observed his teacher walking to the front of the class. With an animated and slightly loud voice, All Might greeted the students, causing Midoriya to cover his ears slightly due to the combination of his classmates' murmurs and All Might's booming tone. He continued, explaining that this would be the subject where they would learn the essentials of becoming a hero. The symbol of peace walked to a wall so everyone could see him and knocked twice on the surface. The secret compartment opened, revealing several boxes, each labeled with the corresponding seat numbers of the students, surprising them as they had thought those compartments were just part of the wall. He informed them that their hero costumes would be necessary for the training and would help them understand the realism of using their outfits in a real battle. After a brief pause, he seemed to discreetly glance at one student in particular before instructing them to change and then head to Beta Field. The students responded in unison, except for Midoriya, who simply nodded in affirmation while looking at the box with his seat number that contained his hero costume. The green-haired boy had designed a more comfortable outfit that would facilitate his movements and be less conspicuous, similar to what Aizawa-sensei wore, simple yet practical. All the students headed to their respective changing rooms to retrieve their hero costumes. Midoriya, as always, moved away from his classmates to avoid revealing the scars on his body. However, something amusing happened this time. Mineta attempted to peek at the girls in the adjacent changing room but was quickly discovered and dealt with by Jairu and Momo, who knew his intentions almost immediately. Midoriya found it funny to watch his classmate get chased back to the boys' area in search of refuge. Once dressed, the students made their way to Beta Field as instructed by All Might. Their costumes were impressive. The company that had an exclusive contract with the school required students to provide details about their quirks, physical measurements, and design preferences for their hero outfits before enrollment. Some wore more extravagant costumes, while others opted for simpler, combat-ready designs that effectively complemented their abilities. Upon arriving at Beta Field through the main door, All Might stood on the other side. As he watched the students approach, he took note of how well their hero costumes suited them, especially how some matched their quirks. Among the students, he discreetly observed Izuku Midoriya, who had caught his attention during Aizawa's test as he navigated through the 8 physical challenges with his quirk. However, he had not seen him summon any of his supposed Shikigami. When he spotted Izuku, he noticed that the boy was slightly apart from the others, standing in a corner. All Might took a moment to examine his hero costume and was surprised. Izuku wore a cape similar to Tokoyami's, but it resembled a black raincoat. Around his neck was a metallic mouthpiece of the same color, accented with a white line running horizontally through it. He wore long pants paired with boots, while the hilt of a large sword with a golden handle peeked out from beneath his cloak. Toshinori felt the pressure surrounding him increase due to the shadows that enveloped the young Midoriya, which seemed to cling to him relentlessly. Once everyone settled down to focus on their teacher, All Might cleared his throat and redirected his attention to the class, eager to see how the events would unfold. Izuku listened intently from the back of the room, unable to see All Might clearly but able to hear him well. All Might announced that they would begin combat training, explaining that it would teach them how to react under stress, panic, and the tension of battle against their adversaries. He noticed a student raising his hand. It was Lita, dressed in what looked like a futuristic knight's suit, who had a question. He asked if they would be doing urban combat again in the same place as their entrance exam, sparking curiosity among the other students. All Might clarified that they would be advancing 2 levels in this training. He explained that while people often see heroes battling villains in broad daylight, the most dangerous villains lurk in the shadows, preying on the defenseless without being seen. His tone was animated yet more serious as he discussed this topic. Izuku agreed with the symbol of peace. He understood that actions like house arrests, imprisonments, kidnappings, or theft of personal information were things villains would never attempt in plain sight. Having grown up in the shadows, he had learned to adapt and fight against them to reach his current level. This training would highlight the difference between him and his classmates, as he had fought from a young age to strengthen himself against his Shikigami and the unique abilities they possessed. It was a valuable opportunity to see how different it would be to fight alongside ordinary people. Tsuyu Azui raised her hand, asking about basic training. All Might explained that this battle would be comprehensive to understand those principles, emphasizing that they would not be fighting robots that could simply be destroyed. He stood with his hands on his hips, inviting questions. Several students raised their hands, asking if there would be expulsions like with Aizawa-sensei, if they could hit their classmates, how a winner would be determined, and one even commented on the coolness of All Might's cape. Toshinori noted in his personal notebook to avoid asking the class if they had questions. Returning to the topic, All Might explained that the exercise involved villains hiding a nuclear weapon inside the building. The hero team had to locate and retrieve it. To win, they needed to capture the villains or touch the weapon, claiming it as theirs. The villains, on the other hand, had to hold off the heroes for 15 minutes or force them out of the building to win. All Might produced a cardboard box from seemingly nowhere and announced that the teams would be chosen randomly. Lita raised his hand again, questioning the necessity of randomness and suggesting that they should choose their partners to complement each other better. A boy with distinctive curly hair interjected, explaining that in a natural disaster or a fight against unknown villains, they needed to be prepared to work alongside others whose abilities they might not fully understand. Many heroes teamed up with people from different agencies. Lita was surprised to hear Midoriya's voice beside him, not understanding how he had moved from the back to his side. He felt a bit uneasy having him so close, as Midoriya's presence was intimidating despite his calm demeanor. However, he understood the point Midoriya was making and nodded in acknowledgement. Midoriya returned his gaze forward, waiting for All Might to continue. The symbol of peace decided to alleviate the tension by drawing names for the first teams. Team A would be the heroes, while Team B would simulate the villains. After rummaging through the box for a few moments, he pulled out the names for Team A, Izuku Midoriya and Ochako Uraraka. Ochako was taken aback when she saw Izuku. Their eyes met, causing her to quickly look away. Although he had saved her, she felt nervous about having to fight alongside him. After forming the first team, All Might continued to draw names for Team B, which would consist of Tenya Lida and Katsuki Bakugu. Lida murmured in disbelief, worried about being paired with Bakugu. Ochako echoed his sentiment, unable to believe she would be facing off against the two most intimidating students in Class 1E. Izuku noticed his teammates' nervousness and hoped it wouldn't affect her focus during the combat exercise. All Might instructed Team B to head to the location of the weapon while the other students would observe the battle from the monitoring room. Before Bakugu entered the building, he shot a glance at Deku, who met his gaze with determination. Bakugu was aware that his former friend had become increasingly distrustful and intimidating over the years, but he was confident in his own strength and was determined to prove it to Deku and the rest of their class, showcasing his superiority and talent. As they exchanged unwavering glances, the only thing visible was the gleam of determination in their eyes, ready to confront each other head-on. A small spark of electricity seemed to flow between them. Lida noticed that Bakugu was taking his time, so he called out for him to come up the stairs. Bakugu grunted in response, still glaring at Deku, but eventually turned away and headed toward the nuclear weapon they were supposed to secure. The green-haired boy glanced back at his old friend for a moment before turning to where Uraraka was standing, still somewhat nervous and deep in thought. Gradually, the spectators in the monitoring room would witness the clash between two old friends. All Might sensed the tension between Izuku and the young Bakugu, so he intentionally paired them together, hoping they could resolve their issues through action rather than words. Outside the UA building, Team B was simulating villains during the hero training session led by All Might. Uraraka and Deku were studying the building plans they had been given, which detailed the number of rooms but, more importantly, indicated there were only 2 exits. They needed to choose a route that would allow them to enter the building as stealthily as possible. The green-haired boy analyzed the situation he and his partner would face, even though he preferred to enter the building alone, believing he could handle it by himself. However, he knew he needed to learn to synchronize his abilities with the rest of his teammates and heroes from other agencies, as that was the essence of the exercise. He wondered how effective or challenging that would be. While Izuku contemplated their approach, Uraraka, who kept a safe distance from him, struggled to remember his name. She recalled Bakugu calling him Deku, but that didn't matter now. She felt unlucky to be paired with Deku and the explosive blonde, as there seemed to be a lot of tension between the two. She could sense it in their interactions and worried it might put her in danger during the combat exercise. Being so close to Izuku, she could feel the dark aura surrounding him, amplified by his deep green eyes that reflected a typical darkness. It was unsettling for a boy of his age. Thinking aloud, she suggested that since it would take too long to circle the building and use the back exit, they should enter through a 3rd-floor window, which wouldn't be a problem thanks to her quirk. She speculated that their opponents wouldn't know which entrance they would use, so they would have to take the risk of facing Lida or perhaps Kaken. She turned to her partner, asking if he agreed with her plan. When she didn't respond immediately, Deku gently placed a hand on her shoulder, causing her to jump back slightly. She turned to him, still a bit nervous from his touch. After a moment, she agreed, nodding her head affirmatively. Deku looked at her, surprised that no one but Kaken had called him by that nickname for years. Although he didn't mind it too much, he wanted to tell her how he felt about it, perhaps a bit annoyed, but he didn't have the chance. A voice echoed through a loudspeaker, capturing the attention of both Team A and Team B. Testing, testing, can you hear me? Teams A and B will fight indoors. One of the 2 teams must win before the 10 minutes are up. Izuku prepared himself by putting on a metallic mouthguard, giving him a more intimidating appearance. He and Uraraka got ready to enter the simulated building. Inside, Lida was examining the weapon, realizing it was made of cardboard or papier-mâché. As expected, it wasn't real, but it did resemble a nuclear bomb. Behind him, Bakugo had remained silent since entering, wearing a disconcerting smile. Lita noted the rivalry between Midoriya and Bakugo but hoped it wouldn't distract them during the training. Lita suggested that Bakugo stay behind to guard the weapon while he went to find Midoriya and Uraraka. He reminded Bakugo to protect the weapon. However, Bakugo shot him an annoyed look, his expression intimidating. He ordered Lita to be quiet and insisted that he would handle Deku and Round Face. This was personal between him and Izuku, and he clenched his teeth in determination. Lita felt a bead of sweat trickle down his forehead. He hadn't anticipated the rivalry between the two boys to be so intense. He reminded Bakugo that while he and Midoriya had their issues, they were at the most prestigious academy in Japan. He couldn't just confront them on a whim. They needed a plan, and they had to stick to it while protecting the weapon. Bakugo ignored Lita's words, focusing instead on the door that led outside, where he would soon face the DM in broccoli. He recalled how Izuku hadn't used his full strength during the exercises with Professor Aizawa, and it was unforgivable for Kaken to be surpassed by someone he considered weaker. Even now, he felt he was still stronger than Izuku. Everything was the same. Since he was young, Deku had always been more solitary than the other children. Bakugo was seen in a favorable light, but after their childhood fight, which ended without a clear winner, Deku felt he had unfinished business with that arrogant rival who had stood in his way. Now, he finally had the chance and he was confident it would be easy, or so he hoped. As All Might announced the start of the competition, a loud beep echoed throughout the building, signaling the beginning of the show. It was always exciting to watch first-year students compete against each other. Izuku, along with Uraraka, prepared to enter the building using her quirk. She took his hands, feeling his soft skin for a moment before activating her power, making him float. Izuku grasped the edge of the third-floor window as planned, and opened it without any trouble since it was not locked. Uraraka followed suit, floating up to the window, and with Deku's help, she entered the building as well. Once inside, the two teenagers moved stealthily through the hallways. Izuku was calm, glancing ahead and stopping briefly to check the corners of each hallway, ensuring no one was nearby before continuing. Uraraka followed closely behind, still nervous but trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't help but be surprised by how quietly her partner moved, even in his black-soled boots. As they walked, Izuku thought it might have been a good idea to summon Shiro or Kuro for assistance and to alert them of any danger. However, he knew enough about his partner to anticipate two things. First, Bakugo would be the one to come looking for him, and second, Lita would be too intimidated by the fiery blonde to refuse any direct orders. After a few minutes inside, Midoriya suddenly stopped near a staircase, causing Uraraka to halt, confused by his stillness. In the monitoring room, the students gathered to watch the first match, focusing on the performance of Midoriya and Bakugo, who were the main fighters. They noted Izuku's chilling calmness during the battle, as he wielded a sword with precision, and his Shikigami seemed to attack with ferocity. It was clear that both boys held a grudge against each other. All Might announced the results of the hero team, highlighting Midoriya's performance, while Uraraka had been too frightened to take action against Bakugo or Lita. The ash blonde was taken to the infirmary for urgent treatment of his deep wounds, which, while not fatal, were painful enough to require Recovery Girl's attention. She remarked that she hadn't seen such skill in a long time, recalling how the number one hero had caused serious injuries in his youth during combat exercises. However, Midoriya's abilities were far more dangerous. Back in the monitoring room, Izuku leaned against a wall, watching the screen for the next match, somewhat distanced from his classmates. He was curious about Todoroki's skills, the participant in this battle, while he noticed his classmates watching him nervously from afar. He chose to ignore their stares and focused on the unfolding second exercise. Todoroki, the daughter of Endeavor, teamed up with Shoji, who had 6 arms, representing the hero team. On the opposing side were Ojiro, who had a prehensile tail, and Toru, the invisible girl, forming the villain team as they prepared to protect their weapon. Ojiro felt uncomfortable having a girl beside him who he couldn't see, but he reminded himself to stay focused. After a minute of preparation, All Might signaled the start of the second match. Invisible Girl planned to surprise Todoroki and Shoji as they entered the building. At the main entrance, the hero team entered without concern. Shoji created several ear-like appendages from his arms, quickly locating the Invisible Girl descending to the third floor, while his partners seemed to be on the fourth, likely where the weapon was hidden. He relayed this information to his teammates through one of his appendages. Todoroki, grateful for the valuable information, moved past Shoji and stopped, resting her left hand against a nearby wall. She turned to him for a moment, asking him to stay back for his safety. With a serious tone, she assured him she would finish this quickly. As the exercise began, the building started to freeze within seconds. Ice spread to every room and corner, even reaching the exterior, covering the hallways completely. Toru, still on the third floor, attempted to descend the stairs but found her feet frozen in place by Todoroki's ice, feeling an intense cold wrap around her. She realized she couldn't move freely. One wrong move could lead to disaster. The students in the monitoring room were equally astonished by Todoroki's skill, comparing it to Midoriya's performance in the first exercise, though they expected less from the daughter of the number 2 hero. Izuku felt intrigued by the way Todoroki used his quirk, even though he didn't fully understand how it worked. It was evident that it was related to the left side of his body, as he hadn't used his right hand to freeze the building. Now, Izuku realized why he felt warmth when sitting on Todoroki's right side, while sitting on the left brought a refreshing breeze. He was captivated by Todoroki's cool demeanor, which occasionally shifted to warmth. There was something about the girl who seemed to keep her own secrets, much like Todoroki. Perhaps it was because Izuku sensed that she was holding back, just as he did, possibly for her own reasons. Returning to the bicolor-haired girl, she walked through the halls toward the 4th floor, where the weapon was supposed to be. She passed by the Invisible Girl, whom she ignored, knowing that the girl was frozen in place. After climbing the stairs and walking through the corridors, she finally reached the weapon. Ojiro, who also had his feet frozen to the floor, couldn't move, aware that he shouldn't exert too much force. Suddenly, the door in front of him opened. Todoroki entered the room, moving confidently toward the weapon alongside the boy with the prehensile tail, who assumed a combat position. The girl watched him, advancing with a serious expression. Ojiro could only grunt as he watched Todoroki pass by, extending his right hand toward the weapon and touching its surface. An alarm sounded, but this time it announced that the hero team had won. Everyone in the monitoring room was surprised, except for Izuku, who seemed to notice things about the girl that no one else did. Moments later, the ice began to melt throughout the building as Shoto used his fire half, raising the surrounding temperature to vaporize the ice into small droplets scattered across the walls, floor, and ceiling. The girl turned to look at Ojiro, who had not stopped staring at her. She expressed her regret, acknowledging that their abilities were incomparable, speaking in a serious tone but attempting to encourage him to keep going. After All Might announced the winning team, everyone in the monitoring room trembled from the intense cold surrounding them. Even Izuku felt the chill, but he found it fascinating to witness Todoroki's incredible abilities. Despite the cold, he let out a soft, satisfied sigh, feeling an inexplicable sense of contentment. Following the announcement of the second match results, some praised the girl for finishing almost immediately, in just 2 minutes, which was comparable to the 6.5 minutes it took Deku to win his first exercise. As the third match began, Kirishima and Siro prepared to fight against heroes Tsu and Tokoyami. Everything unfolded normally as Izuku remained in his position, leaning against the wall behind his classmates to get a better view of the third match, where other individuals with interesting quirks would battle. Tokoyami, who seemed to have a quirk related to darkness, piqued Izuku's curiosity. He felt that their quirks were similar, as Deku used shadows to manifest his Shikigami from a dark dimension where the physical did not seem to exist. From that deep darkness, he could summon beings to assist him in battle. The boy with the raven head appeared to use his shadow to create a powerful beast that lurked beneath his cloak. Although Izuku didn't fully understand how Tokoyami's power worked, it undoubtedly had to do with darkness. He was so lost in thought that he didn't immediately notice the girl with a burn on the right side of her face leaning beside him, maintaining her personal space but close enough to speak. When Izuku realized it was Todoroki, the only girl who seemed unafraid of him, he decided to greet her, even though he didn't fully trust her. He spoke in his usual serious tone, despite wearing his metallic mouthpiece. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Todoroki looked at him, her gaze cold and serious, yet she responded normally. She acknowledged the quick victory in the second exercise, and he complimented her skill, asking if she felt satisfied with the result. Todoroki noted that it had been easy since the villain team was too slow to stop her. She remarked that it hadn't been difficult to achieve victory, just as Izuku seemed to have enjoyed his fight with Bakugo. Izuku listened to her words, realizing she had noticed his enjoyment during the match. However, he didn't truly feel happiness for defeating Bakugo. Instead, he felt he was releasing some pent-up resentment toward the blonde. They had never gotten along well, and their rivalry had grown deeper over the years. Izuku had to hold back to avoid causing serious harm to Kaken during their fight. It hadn't been a battle. It had been a humiliation for Bakugo. He responded to Todoroki, still watching the fight on the monitor, and expressed his feelings about the match. Kaken, despite having lost his pride, still wants to compete with me in many ways, Midoriya stated in a serious, metallic tone through his mouthguard. He mused that one reaps what one sows, he supposed. Todoroki paused for a moment, analyzing Midoriya's words. He sensed a deep tone in his voice, along with a hint of anger, perhaps directed at Bakugo. Although he was unaware of the nature of their relationship, it was evident from a distance that the two shared a history, possibly from their childhood. The girl observed the intense gaze of the green-haired boy as he looked to the side, directly at the simulated battle occurring in Building D. Shoto raised a finger from his left hand and playfully poked Midoriya in the right side of his neck, causing him to jump slightly. The girl noticed how Midoriya blushed a bit from the unexpected action. "What was that?" he asked, his tone a mix of surprise and embarrassment, evident by the slight flush around his mouthguard. Todoroki had only intended to tease Midoriya, who now appeared somewhat nervous but less serious than before, which the girl found adorable. How cute, she thought, maintaining her serious expression and gaze fixed on Midoriya. "I'm sorry, I just thought you looked so serious that I wanted to lighten the mood," Todoroki replied, turning her head to see him better. "You and Bakugo don't get along, do you?" she asked, curiosity glimmering in her eyes. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck, trying to calm himself as his cheeks warmed from Todoroki's sudden action. However, he quickly composed himself to respond to the girl, who seemed to be showing kindness in her own way. This was strange yet pleasant for him. Clearing his throat to return to his usual tone, though still slightly flushed beneath his mask, he explained that they didn't get along well. When they were kids, they were very close, but everything changed after a silly fight that drove them apart. He whispered so that none of their classmates would overhear. "I guess time changes people, doesn't it?" he asked, glancing at Todoroki, who wore a somewhat softer expression as he observed him again. "I see. That must be tough, even to this day, right?" Todoroki asked, still looking at him, her tone formal but laced with understanding. Izuku let out a light sigh, accompanied by a dry, metallic chuckle in response. "You said it, Todoroki-kun. But I bet Kaken is too proud to accept the defeat he suffered at my hands." He returned to his usual tone, though a hint of sarcasm colored his voice. "I hope he doesn't become more of a nuisance than he already is. Anyway, I'm just rambling, so I guess he'll give me his answer when we fight again," he clarified confidently, stretching his arms upward. Shoto watched as Midoriya relaxed a bit while stretching his arms backward. She sensed a sarcastic grace in his voice, but also a lot of resentment directed at Bakugo. Although she didn't fully understand the issues between them from childhood, it was clear neither wanted to discuss it. She assumed that the green-haired boy was not ready to talk about his feelings for Katsuki Bakugo, and she suspected they shared the same thoughts. Todoroki poked Midoriya's neck again, catching him off guard. The sudden contact made him squeak softly to avoid drawing attention, and he blushed slightly beneath his mask, which the girl found adorable. "Don't do that," he replied in a low tone while touching his neck. Shoto looked at him with a gentle smile, surprising him, as it was the first time Izuku had seen her smile. I'm sorry, but since you lied to me, I had to give you a little punishment. It's not good to lie to ladies, you know? She clarified in her serious tone, yet still smiling softly. Izuku fell silent for a moment, watching the girl in front of him, who seemed to be friendly toward him. This made him chuckle a bit, as he felt she was trying to cheer him up in some way. After hearing his soft laughter, Todoroki noticed how he smiled beneath his mouthguard. I'll keep that in mind for next time, Todoroki, he said, still slightly flushed, lifting his cheeks toward her to show he was smiling. The girl couldn't quite describe it, but she felt she had heard Midoriya's words long ago, which puzzled her about her own behavior. Ever since her older sister Fuyumi had told her about the green-haired boy who saved her, she had thought he seemed like a nice person. However, she never imagined she would let her guard down around him, even for a moment. It was unusual for her, especially since she had been raised as her father's masterpiece, trained to be superior to the other students at UA. Yet, there was someone who challenged that notion. Izuku Midoriya, who was not her friend but undeniably a pleasant person once known better. She hadn't expected to show kindness toward him. Todoroki's main goal was to rise to the top of the hero ranks while thwarting her father's plans, using her ice half and her mother's side to prove she didn't need his power to be number one. Noticing how thoughtful Todoroki-kun seemed, lost in her thoughts and forgetting their conversation, Izuku decided to cheer her up in his own way. This involved briefly removing his mouthguard and leaning closer to her ear, gently exhaling his breath, causing Shoto to shiver. She pulled away, holding her ear in surprise, processing what he had done. However, a slight blush crept onto her cheeks, making her appear cute, or so thought the green-haired boy. I thought it was my turn to clear your mind. Todoroki smiled gently while holding her mouthguard in her right hand. Izuku looked at her for a moment, maintaining his smile. It was fortunate that no one else had noticed them, as they were focused on the fight displayed on the monitor and were not paying attention to the boy and girl behind them. Todoroki glanced at the boy in front of her, observing his smile while feeling her heart race a bit faster than usual, which struck her as odd. She briefly considered that she might be unwell but dismissed the thought, knowing it was just Midoriya's presence affecting her. Feeling flustered, Todoroki stomped her left foot down, creating a wall of ice. Midoriya, caught off guard, quickly retreated to avoid it and fell to the ground. He noticed that everyone was now looking at them due to her sudden attack. However, he also saw that Todoroki still had a blush on her cheeks as their eyes met for a moment before she turned and walked toward the exit of the monitoring room. She announced that she was going to the bathroom, her cheeks still flushed as she turned down the hallway and left. Midoriya got back up, rolling his eyes at the girl's behavior. He guessed she had gotten nervous when she played that little joke, and likely left to avoid being seen in that state. He knew he would have to apologize to her later for what had happened. In the infirmary at UA Academy, All Might approached Recovery Girl as she treated the already bandaged wounds of Katsuki Bakugo. The elderly woman turned to look at Toshinori with a slightly furrowed brow and let out a soft sigh. She demanded to know exactly what had happened to the boy. All Might, who had just finished his class moments earlier, rushed to the infirmary to ensure that Bakugo was asleep and unaware of the steam escaping his body, a sign he was nearing the limit of his transformation. As he arrived, his body deflated like a broken steam machine while he looked at Recovery Girl again. He rubbed the back of his neck and explained that they had a basic hero training day, but he had conducted a group combat exercise. The first pair-up was Bakugo and Midoriya, who seemed to have a rivalry. He felt embarrassed as he diverted his gaze to the floor, admitting that pairing them together to resolve their issues had been a bad idea, recalling how he used to resolve conflicts with an old friend. However, the fight had gotten a bit out of control. Recovery Girl sighed again and looked at All Might, still with a frown. She extended her hand toward the sedated Bakugo and pointed out that his injuries were treatable with her quirk, but he had pushed himself too hard in battle, and she couldn't handle everything at once. She reproached him for not stopping Bakugo and Midoriya from the start, reiterating that the intravenous treatment had taken effect and he just needed rest for now. However, she noted that his injuries were not typical for a basic hero training exercise and insisted that All Might should have intervened earlier. Toshinori felt guilty for Bakugo and the situation he had put him in. He had modified the training equipment to allow Midoriya and Bakugo to fight together, never expecting their rivalry to escalate so intensely. It was clear there was some unresolved animosity between the two, and he had witnessed how Midoriya showed no mercy towards his opponents, making him question the young hero's moral compass. He was relieved that Midoriya had enough sense not to inflict a fatal injury on Bakugo. This led Toshinori to ponder the deep darkness he had seen reflected in Midoriya's eyes, which obscured his true feelings. He had noticed a flicker of surprise when Todoroki had suddenly attacked Midoriya while they were observing the other groups, along with a hint of embarrassment that he couldn't quite understand. Recovery Girl broke his thoughts by asking if he was thinking about that boy, Izuku Midoriya. All Might was taken aback that she had noticed his contemplation but nodded in confirmation. She mentioned that she had seen Midoriya's medical records and noted that he had never had any illnesses throughout his life. However, she recalled a visit to a hospital where a doctor had declared that he had been quirkless, or as it was called, without a quirk. Toshinori pondered her words. It was indeed curious that Midoriya had been quirkless before gaining his current power, and it wasn't surprising that he had awakened his abilities later than usual. Recovery Girl remarked that it was strange, Midoriya had never shown symptoms of even a simple cold. She had found a note in his records indicating that it was as if his mind had a questionable dark spot in the frontal lobe, but it had never affected his life. She stroked her chin as she shared this information with the number 1 hero. Even Toshinori was unsure of the meaning, but it seemed related to Midoriya's quirk since the more he used it, the larger the dark spot in his brain became. He explained this with a somewhat serious tone. Toshinori, not as knowledgeable about medicine as his colleague, who was a true expert, feared the worst for young Midoriya upon hearing that one of his students had a dark spot in his brain that was expanding with the use of his power. He asked with concern if Midoriya's life was in danger. Recovery Girl quickly shook her head and then looked up to meet All Might's gaze. She believed that the spot Midoriya had was likely a part of his quirk, possibly a side effect, but she couldn't confirm anything unless the boy came in for a checkup. She turned and pulled something from her desk drawer. The spot had appeared 4 years ago when the boy first awakened his quirk during a childhood fight with Bakugo. She handed him the portfolio she had retrieved so he could see the brain scan. As Toshinori examined the dark spot, he realized it wasn't very large but was located in the frontal part of Midoriya's brain. Recovery Girl clarified that while it might be a side effect of his quirk, it was unclear whether it could pose a health issue for Midoriya. Since awakening his quirk, he had lived a normal life without falling ill. Any doctor from before the emergence of quirks would have been alarmed and conducted numerous tests to find the cause of the issue. However, if the UA nurse said there was a risk to the green-haired boy's life, it had to be true. Still, Toshinori felt the need to ask one more question. He inquired if there was anything else he should know before leaving, returning the portfolio to her. Recovery Girl took the portfolio and placed it back with the medical records of other students at UA. She then looked back at the number 1 hero and shook her head in response. For now, she lacked further information regarding Midoriya's condition, but as long as he didn't show any discomfort during training, he could continue attending the hero course normally. She promised to inform him if she learned anything, reassuring him not to worry while adjusting her glasses. All Might paused for a moment in silence, lowering his gaze slightly before looking back at Recovery Girl and nodding in acknowledgement. He expressed his gratitude sincerely, appreciating her help. Recovery Girl nodded with a smile in response to Toshinori. After a moment, they shifted to discussing trivial matters to ease the tension from their intense conversation about the most mysterious boy in Class 1A. Meanwhile, neither of the professional heroes noticed that the blonde boy on the stretcher had awakened during their discussion. Although he couldn't distinguish the voice of Recovery Girl, he caught the name All Might and heard about a green-haired boy who had made Bakugo furious. The blonde had to control his anger, feeling his heart race at the memory of the humiliation he suffered at the hands of Izuku Midoriya, whom Bakugo referred to as Deku. He was still processing the sharp pain coursing through his body from that fight, where he had thought he held the advantage. He hadn't anticipated such a significant difference between his quirk and Izuku's, who hadn't even needed the help of his other Shikigamis to confront him. Instead, he had underestimated Midoriya, using only his stupid dogs to fight, not realizing he should have unleashed his full power. Silence enveloped Bakugo's mind as he remained stunned by the thought that Deku had managed to defeat him. He refused to accept this outcome. He needed to become much stronger and surpass Deku in every way to prove he was the strongest. It was a matter he had to resolve with Midoriya to amend what had been left unresolved since childhood. Until he could at least defeat him in a fight, he felt he couldn't move on to the next level. He pondered why he felt doomed to lose every time he faced Midoriya, the image of Deku's eyes lingering in his mind. Classes had finally ended. Midoriya watched as the other teams performed in the combat exercise led by All Might, whom he had admired greatly as a child. Even now, he still held that admiration, though it was not as intense as when he had decorated his room with posters, figurines, and carpets featuring the symbol of peace. Over time, the green-haired boy's spirits had waned, as he had never been so close to his great hero until now. After a while, the day concluded, but Bakugo never showed up, perhaps still too injured from their fight or too embarrassed to face Midoriya again. Izuku leaned toward the latter option. During the rest of the class, he felt the occasional gaze of two classmates, Ochako and Todoroki, who seemed to be watching him closely after class ended. Ochako often glanced at Midoriya nervously, wanting to thank him and apologize for not helping him. She was deep in thought about how to address the situation with Ida and the weapon. Fear gripped her as she recalled the thought of having to fight Bakugo. Even though she realized it was Deku, she couldn't shake off the nervousness brought on by his cold gaze and the bloodied sword he had held during that moment. Izuku was aware of Todoroki's gaze but kept his distance, looking out the window and waiting for the recess bell to ring. The girl who could be considered his closest friend in Class 1A was Todoroki Shoto, who had previously startled him in the monitoring room. Although she had been reprimanded for it, the incident was overlooked since Izuku had not been hurt. The memory of his breath near her ear made her shiver slightly. It was strange because she had never felt that way around anyone before, especially not in front of a boy. Yet, Deku had managed to elicit a smile from her in a way she never imagined she would give to him. She had to admit that she was intrigued by his personality. He could be both cold and fierce, especially in his fights against Katsuki Bakugo. However, she felt that with her, he was different, as he seemed to lose a bit of his composure, even if just for a few seconds. The smile he had shown her earlier felt like a distant memory, one she couldn't quite place. He was a strange boy, but kind at the same time. He seemed to know when to lighten his expression, especially when he made that little joke that had caused her to momentarily lose her composure. She had never shown nervousness around anyone because she believed it would reveal weakness. It was different with Midoriya, and in a way, it was pleasant that he had made her feel that way, even if he had gone a bit far with his teasing. On his part, Midoriya felt an unusual pressure on his body as he noticed Todoroki's unwavering gaze on him. He knew she might still be thinking about their brief interaction in the monitoring room, and he felt he should apologize. However, the thought made him a bit anxious. While he was skilled in fighting, he struggled with words, especially when it came to girls outside of the academy. Still, he knew he had to do it. It felt like a challenge to himself to apologize. After a few more minutes, the bell rang inside UA, signaling the end of class for the students of Class 1. Midoriya calmly packed his things into his backpack before exiting the classroom, where some of his classmates continued chatting about their plans after school. The green-haired boy still felt both Todoroki's intense gaze and Uraraka's discreet glance directed at him. As he left the classroom, he could see through UA's windows that evening had fallen, painting the clouds in shades of orange and red. The sight of the tree branches swaying brought him a sense of calm, knowing the day had come to an end. However, he still had something to do before heading home. Izuku walked through the halls of UA until he reached the exit, feeling the cool breeze hit his face. He leaned against the entrance wall, waiting for Todoroki, even though she hadn't mentioned anything about it. He simply wanted to ensure they were okay, as he enjoyed talking to her. Perhaps, in the future, they could become friends, but to achieve that he needed to get to know her and see if she was also interested in knowing more about him. After all, everyone had their secrets, and Midoriya respected that. The freckled teenager let out a soft sigh, realizing it was the first time he had shown interest in someone and cared about what the other person might think of him. He only felt this way with his mother, showing interest in their conversations, spending time together, and enjoying a plate of katsudon she would prepare for him. Perhaps the green-haired boy wanted to remember that feeling of tranquility when being close to someone he wanted to know better. He chuckled dryly, finding it curious how things happened in such unpredictable ways. He hadn't seen Todoroki in a while and assumed she had already left school, but she still hadn't appeared. So, Deku decided to wait a little longer. When he turned his gaze forward, he suddenly felt a chill and a slight pressure on his neck, making him shiver before he quickly stepped back and turned to see who it was. He was startled and stepped back a bit, looking over his shoulder. It was Todoroki, and he felt a mix of surprise and embarrassment. She confirmed it, still holding her finger out before lowering it to meet his gaze. She asked him why he was still there, curious if he had been waiting for her. Izuku hadn't expected her to be so direct and to notice so quickly. He touched the spot on his neck where she had already touched him 3 times that day, unsure if she was teasing him or seeking some sort of revenge for what had happened in the monitoring room. After a brief moment of silence, he cleared his throat to regain his composure and speak to her, though he still felt a bit flushed. He admitted he wanted to know if he could accompany her home, hoping it wouldn't bother her. Todoroki paused for a moment, processing what her classmate had said. Although it was the first time someone had asked to accompany her home, she felt a bit wary about Midoriya's request. Who knew what could happen if she shared her home address, where her siblings and older sister Fuyumi, along with her father, were? After about a minute of silence, she responded calmly. She agreed but reminded him to keep his distance as she began to walk, and Midoriya instinctively followed her. The 2 teenagers walked side by side, with Midoriya respecting her personal space as she had requested, allowing her to guide him on the way to her home. The journey was quiet and somewhat uncomfortable for the green-haired boy, as he wasn't sure if Todoroki was still upset about what had happened in the monitoring room. However, when he glanced at her, she seemed to maintain her usual calm and serious expression, much like his own. The sky was painted red by the sunset, and a gentle, cool breeze flowed from north to south in front of them. The stillness reminded Izuku of the silence that had followed his confrontation with Bakugo when he had gone to find the weapon and encountered Uraraka. It felt different now, as if it were just the 2 of them walking down the street, creating a relaxing atmosphere that he hoped would last until they reached her home. After about 10 minutes, Izuku arrived at the Todoroki residence alongside the girl. She stopped in front of her home, indicating they had reached their destination. Midoriya would be lying if he said he wasn't a little surprised by the large house, which appeared much more spacious than his own apartment. It resembled a traditional Japanese mansion, likely acquired effortlessly by Shoto's father with his wealth. He remarked on the beauty of the house, noting how lovely it was. Shoto turned to look at him again, noticing the slight surprise in his eyes before returning to her usual expression. She acknowledged his compliment but reminded him that living in a beautiful house didn't necessarily mean that good things happened inside it. She thanked him for walking her home and mentioned they would see each other in class the next day. As she searched for her keys in her pocket, Izuku felt this was the perfect moment to apologize before she entered her home. He was a bit nervous but steeled himself before clearing his throat to get her attention. When she turned to look at him, he hesitated for a moment before expressing his need to apologize for what had happened in the monitoring room, admitting he was sorry if he had made her uncomfortable with his foolish joke. Shoto regarded him for a moment, processing his words and his apology. It was true that his actions had made her feel uncomfortable, as she was not used to showing such emotions, especially in front of others. She felt a bit annoyed with him for that. With a slight frown, she stepped away from the door and walked toward him, causing him to feel a bit startled. She stopped in front of him, looking directly into his eyes with an even more serious expression. Izuku felt a bead of sweat trickle down his cheek, worried that she was still upset with him. Then she raised her hands and gently placed them on his cheeks, holding them firmly. He was taken aback by her touch, feeling the softness of her hands on his face, yet unsure of her intentions. They remained silent, gazing into each other's eyes, until she began to tug at his cheeks with a bit of force, causing him discomfort. He complained about the pain while asking her what she was doing, keeping his eyes closed. Despite the discomfort, he didn't resist her actions. Shoto, still pulling at his cheeks, looked into his closed eyes and spoke in a serious tone, slightly annoyed. She asked if he truly regretted what had happened, emphasizing that he should not embarrass a girl in that way. Izuku leaned forward slightly as she continued to tug at his cheeks, eventually nodding his head in agreement. He assured her that he understood and gently took her hands, signaling her to stop. Releasing him with a slight smile, Shoto felt she had successfully made her point. After a moment, she let go of his cheeks, and he touched his face with both hands, feeling a bit sore. However, seeing him smile again made her think he wasn't truly angry about what she had done. He then asked if they were okay, touching his cheek and looking at her calmly. Shoto considered his expression, realizing he didn't seem upset about her earlier actions. She reflected on his earlier words, recognizing that he had waited to apologize, which made her suspect there was more to him than met the eye. It was unusual for someone to take the time to wait until the end of the day just to say sorry. Clearing her throat, she returned to her usual demeanor and looked into his green eyes, or rather the one eye visible due to his hair. She confirmed that they were indeed fine, speaking in her usual tone. Hearing her response, Midoriya smiled softly and gave a slight bow, leaving Shoto in thought. She was unsure how to respond to his smile, as it was uncommon for her to connect so well with someone from her school. Typically, she didn't expect to integrate with her classmates, feeling it was unnecessary unless teamwork was required, which was not a problem for her. It seemed both Todoroki and Midoriya were wary of those around them, particularly those who sought to get to know them. As their gazes met, Izuku sensed that she also found it challenging to socialize with others. He suggested it was getting late and recommended she go inside to rest comfortably and avoid the cold. "Good evening, Todoroki-kun," she said, giving him one last smile before turning to leave. Izuku wondered why he was being so formal. What was happening to him? He kept his smile as he turned away. Shoto watched as the boy walked away, pondering his words. He felt that someone outside his family cared about his well-being, which was a strange sensation. He just wanted the day to end so he could start fresh tomorrow. He turned back, pulled the key from his pocket, and approached the door. "Good night," he murmured under his breath, glancing at the door before stepping inside his home. It had been a strange day and night for both teenagers, who were beginning to feel emotions they had never experienced before. The most overwhelming part was that neither of them understood what these feelings were, or perhaps they were simply in denial. Chapter End. Location: UA Academy entrance. A reporter called out to a young boy with curly green hair, asking him about All Might's teaching methods and whether they were as good as the rumors suggested. Izuku stood in silence, observing the crowd of reporters in front of him. He noticed a few classmates from Class 1A trying to respond to the relentless questions from the press, which was overwhelming since everyone just wanted to get inside the academy and continue their studies. What a hassle, Midoriya thought, rolling his eyes as he turned to walk through the throng of reporters. All Might, the #1 hero, was a symbol of hope who filled the hearts of the innocent with the belief that everything was alright because he was there. His iconic phrase, accompanied by his characteristic smile, brought a sense of peace, assuring everyone that a great, muscular hero would save them from danger. However, being the greatest hero also came with consequences, such as having his social life scrutinized by the media, who followed him wherever he went. Many other heroes faced similar situations, with false rumors potentially harming their lives depending on whether people believed the whispers in the shadows. The UA principal, Nizu, had tried his best to keep Toshinori's new role as a teacher under wraps, but it was nearly impossible. The news that the symbol of peace would be teaching at the most prestigious hero academy in Japan, ranked #1 in hero training, quickly spread throughout the country, much like a famous singer's announcement on a world tour. Midoriya thought the attention was unnecessary for someone wanting to be a teacher, but he kept his thoughts to himself, knowing it was too late to mention it. What truly worried him was hoping All Might wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Who knew when disaster might strike? After a while, the green-haired boy managed to slip through the crowd of journalists and finally entered the UA facilities, breathing in the fresh air free from the pressure outside. He glanced over his shoulder to see reporters still interviewing his classmates, like Ida and Uraraka, who were being held back. Fortunately, most of them had made it inside the UA barrier. One reporter complained loudly, hoping to get a comment from the students, frustrated that they had gathered so little information over the past 2 days. "Hey, just give us a minute. You should at least make a comment," she called out, stepping forward to follow the students. "Wait," one of his classmates tried to warn her, but it was too late. A loud alarm echoed through the entrance as the UA barrier activated, failing to recognize the journalist's credentials. She let out a scream as a massive armored wall rose abruptly, nearly trapping her as she crossed the established boundary. Her classmates helped her up as she grumbled about how the most prestigious academy refused to answer her simple questions about whether All Might was really a teacher, as the rumors suggested. But for now, they were just that, rumors. Back with our protagonist, he was walking through the hallways of his school. He had entered before the rest of his classmates to get ahead. In a few minutes, reached the hallway near his classroom and entered through the giant door, turning the handle calmly as he stepped inside like any other day. Inside the classroom, he saw his classmates from 1A. Some had not yet arrived, while those present were chatting normally. A few were arguing with a blue-haired boy who was being reprimanded by Ida for sitting on the desks, which was amusing to some and annoying to others, especially Bakugu, who received constant reproaches from Tenya. Midoriya walked quietly through the rows of desks, nearly unnoticed by everyone. Well, almost everyone. Bakugu kept glaring at Deku from his seat, his teeth clenched and a low growl escaping him. His expression was filled with resentment, likely still harboring feelings from their last encounter. However, Deku seemed unfazed, noticing that his classmate had recovered well from his injuries thanks to Recovery Girl's effective care. He continued walking normally, settling into his seat while still feeling a slight sting in his cheeks from the playful reprimand Todoroki had given him the previous day when she accompanied him home. It felt as if she treated him like a friend, which was a pleasant thought for him. Though he suspected that she might only be friendly with him, this thought brought a small smile to his face, one that only he noticed before quickly returning to his usual expression. He pulled out a book from his backpack, ready to read until class began. A familiar voice broke the silence behind him, asking why he no longer greeted his classmate. Surprised, Deku turned halfway to see Todoroki, who was looking at him with her usual calm demeanor and serious expression. It felt a bit unusual for her to speak to him so suddenly, but it was not unwelcome. He greeted her back, maintaining his usual tone but with a hint of surprise in his voice. She responded normally, crossing her arms and meeting his gaze. Deku pondered what to say next. He didn't know much about her interests and felt it was inappropriate to ask if she had gotten home safely since he was the one who had walked her back. Instead, he brought up the unexpected presence of the press around the academy, hoping to spark a conversation. Todoroki considered his question for a moment before nodding in agreement. It was not surprising, given that they were in the presence of Japan's symbol of peace. She expressed her hope that the media would not cause them any trouble, especially within the school. Deku agreed, suggesting that as long as they didn't breach the school's boundaries, everything would be fine. Todoroki nodded again, reflecting on how strange it was for her to approach him just to chat. She felt a curiosity to speak with Deku, perhaps because he had caught her interest from the start, initially due to his unique quirk, and now she found herself wanting to engage with him in a more friendly manner. It was easier to converse with him, especially since they had attended the same middle school. In the simulation event unit at USJ, Class 1A was taken aback as figures began to emerge from a thick curtain of dark mist. The newcomers wore outfits vastly different from those of heroes, clad in dark, gothic attire adorned with skull logos, evoking feelings of unease among the students. The teachers immediately went on high alert, particularly Aizawa, who assumed a combat-ready stance, preparing his capture tape and adjusting his glasses. Many students were confused about the situation unfolding before them. Although they had an inkling of what was happening, they found it hard to believe that an attack was occurring. UA was known for its high security, making it difficult for anyone to enter undetected. Some students preferred to think that these were merely fake villains, but Aizawa quickly dismissed that notion, recognizing the reality of their unexpected encounter with real villains at USJ. Ensuring the safety of the students took precedence over confronting the intruders. He clarified that they were indeed facing genuine villains, likely linked to the events from the other day when the press had entered the school. As he assessed the situation, Todoroki noted the sheer number of villains, over 30, perhaps even 70 each, with their own unique abilities, scattered throughout the simulated zones of USJ. Deku quickly scanned the area, identifying 3 individuals who seemed to be in charge, radiating a stronger aura than the others. One of them appeared gaunt, with disheveled ash-blue hair and his body covered in numerous fake hands. The unsettling sight of him obscuring his face with one of those hands made Deku feel a sense of hostility emanating from him. Another villain was a giant, nearly as muscular as All Might, with dark skin and bulging eyes that seemed devoid of life. His wide mouth, filled with sharp teeth, stretched unnaturally, and he moved clumsily until he received a command from the man with the hands, obediently freezing in place. The third villain, who seemed to have entered the training area with ease, appeared to be made entirely of an endless dark purple mist. Only 2 bright flashes resembling eyes were visible, and he seemed capable of creating portals, as the remaining villains emerged from within his form. This trio appeared to be the most dangerous, likely because they were in charge of the operation. The villain with hands all over his body expressed disappointment that All Might had not arrived as scheduled. He sighed behind his mask, lamenting the effort he had put into gathering an audience to witness the demise of the day. He suggested that if they took a few students hostage or harmed them, it might provoke All Might to arrive at the USJ much sooner. Eraser and Midoriya shared expressions of disgust toward the villains, feeling they did not belong there. It was clear they had come to cause harm. Otherwise, why would they show up? The students remained grouped together as Aizawa and 13 had instructed, keeping their guard up, especially Izuku, whose dogs growled at the villains, clearly displeased with them. Midoriya glanced at his teacher, who was preparing to confront the intruders, even though they outnumbered him. It was evident that reasoning with Aizawa-sensei to escape together was impossible. The underground hero had likely devised a plan to buy time for their escape. It was a noble act, so all Midoriya could do was stand by his teacher's side. He took a step forward, along with his loyal companions, preparing to draw his sword from the shadows. Aizawa glanced at his student before stopping him, firmly stating that his duty as a teacher was to protect them, not to incite them to fight. Before the chaos began, Aizawa spoke to the rescue hero, 13, instructing her to protect the students while he held off the villains for as long as possible. 13 nodded in agreement as the underground hero charged at the villains. From their elevated position, the students observed as the villains advanced toward them. Despite the presence of nearly 70 villains, it was unclear how they had infiltrated the school so easily. It was strange, but among the students were both boys and girls with exceptional abilities who could speculate about what had happened with the school's security sensors. Todoroki stepped forward, carefully analyzing the situation. She reasoned that if the villains had entered undetected, one of them must possess a quirk that countered the school's security measures. She noted that this area was isolated from other main facilities, indicating that the villains were not foolish if they wanted to keep the students from moving. The students listened intently to Todoroki's analysis, which provided some clarity to the situation, but they still did not understand the true reason for the villains' presence during class. For now, they relied on Eraserhead and 13 as professional heroes, which put them at a disadvantage if they were to fight, especially if there were more villains lurking nearby. Midoriya observed everything with seriousness, considering that if the villains had a quirk that interfered with the school's sensors, it was possible one of them could also disrupt communications with the outside, which posed a significant problem. As the villains advanced, Aizawa instructed 13 to begin the evacuation and to inform the school about the situation at the USJ if possible. After giving the command, the underground hero leaped toward the villains, who possessed various quirks, whether mutations or emissions. For Aizawa, it was no challenge to erase their quirks before launching his capture tape at them, striking them without concern for their gender. Several villains surrounded Aizawa, who moved agilely against them, using his dark glasses to obscure which quirks he was erasing. This always put his enemies at a disadvantage when he fought. The students watched from a distance as their teachers skillfully engaged multiple opponents. Midoriya noticed how the strange mist seemed to communicate with the villain covered in hands, and he crouched closer to Shiro and Kuro, mentally instructing them to stay alert. One of the four-armed villains asked if Eraser could erase their mutation quirks as well. Aizawa replied that everyone had limitations, even with their quirks, and then countered the villain's predictable attack with a decisive blow that sent him flying. Midoriya recognized how effective and practical Aizawa-sensei's quirk could be. However, he had learned through his classes that every quirk had its strengths and weaknesses. While he identified a flaw in Eraserhead's style, he also realized that Aizawa was physically and mentally ordinary, which meant he had to rely on his cunning and versatility in combat against the thugs he faced. However, there wouldn't always be villains that could be defeated simply by removing their powers, and Izuku felt that the green-haired villain with the exposed brain could be the strongest of them all. He believed they had a better chance of survival if they managed to escape, but that meant leaving their teacher behind for a moment. There wasn't much to discuss, as Eraserhead had already decided to fight the villains to buy time for their escape. Izuku informed number 13 sensei of the situation so they could focus on getting away from the spectacle Eraserhead was creating. She instructed her teammates to follow her as they made their way out of the USJ. In the distance, a villain with hands was scratching the back of his neck while observing how well Eraserhead was handling the small crowd, dominating them with ease. He muttered in annoyance about how he hated professional heroes, noting that the crowd couldn't defeat them. Izuku, along with his dogs and classmates, was running toward the exit of the USJ, with number 13 leading the way. They realized that communication was blocked inside the building, so the best option was to escape and try to contact the school or run directly there. They were very close to the exit when suddenly, one of Izuku's dogs, a black hound, began barking loudly toward the exit, seeming to be the only one who understood the warning about the danger posed by the Shikigami. He urged his classmates to stop while he halted and looked ahead. They complied, coming to a stop alongside number 13 just before reaching the exit. Beneath it, a dark purple mist began to manifest, which appeared to be Kurogyri, extending to block the entire entrance with his misty form. He regarded the students with his two glowing eyes as number 13 positioned herself in front of them, preparing to fight. Before the confrontation, Kurogyri addressed the UA students and their teacher. He formally introduced himself and his group as the League of Villains, stating that they had come to eliminate All Might, the symbol of peace. He observed the students for a moment, noting that All Might had not appeared as scheduled. He questioned whether there had been a change of plans that prevented him from coming, all while his mists spread to cover the exit. As Kurogyri's gaseous form began to rise and expand, preparing to attack, number 13 seemed aware of the impending danger and rushed to use her quirk against the mist villain. However, two students had already leaped forward to confront Kurogyri, Midoriya and Bakugo. Izuku commanded his dogs to try to damage Kurogyri while Kaken launched an explosion at the villain, shaking his form but seemingly causing no harm. The White Hound attempted to pounce on Kurogyri, but he opened a portal within his body, allowing the hound to pass through and another portal behind him for the dog to continue past. Kurogyri expressed mild concern while maintaining his composure, acknowledging the talent of the young heroes despite their age. As Shiro fell through the other portal, he quickly regained his footing, sliding for a moment before growling at Kurogyri, who glanced at him curiously, surprised that animals were allowed in UA training. Midoriya focused intently on the mist villain, noticing something metallic protruding from Kurogyri's gaseous form, resembling armor that encased the villain's body, though he was unsure of its purpose. Kaken, irritated, declared that he would handle the villain himself, dismissing Midoriya as merely a nuisance. Izuku chose to ignore Kaken for the moment, concentrating on the villain before him and considering how to inflict damage with his group. He thought that number 13's quirk might be more effective if they could attack Kurogyri directly to absorb the mist that formed his body. Meanwhile, number 13 was alarmed that the two boys had approached the villain and ordered them to distance themselves as quickly as possible. However, Kurogyri anticipated their movements and extended his mist around the students, creating a tense atmosphere. Midoriya shielded his eyes to see what was happening while his Shikigami struggled to maintain its footing against the dark wind generated by the villain's quirk. The other students found it increasingly difficult to escape the thick mist that began to engulf them, barely able to see what was happening around them. Kurojirai declared his intent to separate them, ensuring they wouldn't interfere with his plans and threatening to torment them until they were defeated. Midoriya opened his eyes wide, trying to advance toward the villain, but as he stepped forward, he felt his weight shift dramatically, causing him to fall downward. Everything happened in the blink of an eye until he spotted a glimmer of light at the end of the vast darkness surrounding him. He lost all sense of stability, realizing he was plummeting into what seemed like a vast ocean, glancing around as he fell, noticing that his black jade dog was falling alongside him. Deku deactivated his quirk respectfully, but only for Kuro, causing him to dissolve into a pool of darkness that vanished into the air without leaving a trace. Moments later, Izuku plunged headfirst into the water, feeling the cold sensation enveloping his body. Izuku decided to remove the cape from his suit to move more freely in the water. He opened his eyes as best as he could to see his surroundings. The first thing he noticed was a man with a shark head and a human body swimming toward him with great speed, displaying sharp teeth. Alarmed, the green-haired boy quickly thought of calling for Orochi or Gamma for help, but before he could, he saw the villain being struck by the leg of a girl with a round face and green hair. Ashrisen, he thought, struggling in the water to keep from sinking. She warned him to hold on before extending her tongue to wrap around his waist. Azui launched another kick toward the shark-headed villain and began swimming swiftly, smiling at Midoriya with her tongue sticking out. In her arms, she carried Mineta, who had fallen into the water with her before encountering Deku. Azui transported Mineta and the green-haired boy through the water at a speed faster than most professional swimmers, thanks to her mutation, but they were not alone. Several villains with abilities that allowed them to breathe underwater were pursuing them, intent on attacking as ordered. This must be the shipwreck zone. That's why there's so much water, he thought as Azui pulled him through the water. After a few minutes, the trio spotted what appeared to be a massive yacht beneath the water, likely designed for the simulation area they were in. Azui extended her tongue to the surface of the ship, releasing Deku so he could fall onto the deck while she did the same with Mineta, who looked quite dizzy from their recent escapade with the villains. He complained while kneeling on the deck. He expressed his frustration, wondering why they had come to kill All Might and what was happening. Azui climbed onto the ship after helping Mineta up, noticing Deku kneeling on the floor. He met her gaze calmly, though his expression remained serious. He thanked her for the help as he stood up and shook his hair a bit. She insisted he call her Tsuyu, glancing around the area, noting how much larger the shipwreck zone was than she had expected. Mineta, feeling queasy, stumbled a bit as he approached the edge of the ship to catch his breath. Midoriya thought about how weak Mineta seemed and began to analyze the situation. He recalled the previous day's intrusion, where the press had supposedly breached UA's defense system. It made more sense to theorize that those villains were responsible for the chaos, using it as a distraction to gather information about their trip. Just as Todoroki-kun had said, they had planned everything meticulously to ensure no one interfered with their plans, possibly separating them from the others to prevent interference when they attacked All Might. He argued that All Might was invincible, that no one was stronger than him, and imagined the hero would come and defeat the villains with powerful blows and kicks, mimicking All Might's movements, though poorly. Midoriya wished he could believe that, but considering the sophistication of the attack they were experiencing, it was clear they were prepared to eliminate the symbol of peace, one way or another. He acknowledged that while All Might was strong, fast, and muscular, he was still human, and it was likely the villains had found a way to defeat him. He noted that the villain with the fog had mentioned torturing them until they were dead, so they needed to prioritize their survival first, grabbing his sword and looking at his companions. Mineta felt uneasy with the calmness in Midoriya's voice as he suggested they survive until All Might arrived, which made him think of various ways he could perish if any of those villains got close enough to him. Tsuyu pondered aloud, wondering if All Might would also come out unscathed, agreeing with Midoriya's logic. Mineta seemed to just realize the gravity of their situation, growing nervous and incredulous at her words. His surprise was short-lived when they suddenly heard something approaching through the water. Midoriya leaned over the safety railing of the yacht to see a swarm of villains with water abilities surrounding the ship, likely preparing to attack them before they could escape. The green-haired boy adjusted his metal mouthpiece, ready to fight if the villains decided to board the ship, but for now, they were merely observing from outside. Meanwhile, in the collapse zone, several villains rushed toward a girl with bicolor white and red hair. She stepped forward with her left foot and froze the ground beneath them, immobilizing the villains from their feet to their torsos, rendering them unable to move without risking injury. To sarcastically questioned their shame in losing to a girl, her tone serious. Todoroki observed the group with a cold gaze for a moment before turning to leave. Dressed in her hero costume, she let out a frosty sigh, reflecting on the plan the man in the mist had shared about separating them and then eliminating them. She realized it had not been as effective as they had hoped. Even though the students of Class 1A were still in training, she was confident they could handle opponents who lacked any specific training and relied solely on their quirks. She expressed her frustration, noting that none of them seemed to know how to utilize their abilities effectively. As she looked up thoughtfully for a moment, she considered the situation. They hadn't gathered their strongest villains. Instead, they had brought a crowd to act as a distraction while they waited for All Might to arrive. As Todoroki pondered, a villain emerged from the bushes, brandishing a knife and attempting to stab her. She swiftly sidestepped, freezing the ground beneath him and encasing him in ice, rendering him immobile. Another villain, resembling a bird, attempted to swoop in from behind with a spear, but she dodged again, grabbing the weapon with her left hand and freezing both it and the villain's body. She remarked to herself about the group of ordinary thugs they faced, breaking the weapon in two with a kick before moving on. She assessed the situation, realizing that only 3 or 4 of the villains posed a significant threat to her classmates and possibly to herself if they crossed paths. Todoroki approached the villain with the knife, who was now crying in pain and despair. She coldly informed him that he had only 10 minutes before his cells froze and he struggled to breathe. She wanted to be a hero, so if he provided her with the information she sought, she would not take his life. She asked him who was behind the chaos they were experiencing. While she intended to intimidate rather than kill, she knew she could easily end his life. However, she felt that taking a life required a level of courage that these villains lacked, especially since they could have harmed her if she hadn't neutralized them first. In the bustling streets of Mizudafu, people hurried along, some late for work. In this world, individuals could be born with quirks that granted them extraordinary abilities, such as wings or the power to teleport. Those with more powerful quirks often dominated society, and the line between heroes and villains blurred as they sought to make the world better, in their own ways, sometimes through extreme measures. Amidst the crowd stood a green-haired boy with curly locks, a strand covering the right side of his face. He stared into the horizon, feeling detached from everything around him. It was a strange day, as the aftermath of the disaster at USJ just 2 days prior still lingered in the air. Midoriya lowered his gaze, still looking toward the horizon, as darkness seemed to envelop him. He saw something only he could perceive, a reflection of who he had been before becoming the person he was now, a boy who had once been indifferent to taking the lives of those who harmed others. This was not the heroic path he had envisioned, and the events at USJ had left him grappling with his choices. He found himself lost in thought, recalling a phone conversation with his mother after she learned about the villain attack. Hearing her voice had brought him some relief, as they rarely spoke. Her concern for his well-being felt like a comforting presence, almost as if they were face to face. Unfortunately, he had not shared the entire truth about what had transpired in that building, not wanting to worry her further, especially about what he had done to the villain with the exposed brain. It was strange. He had always intended to be a hero. Yet, he questioned whether heroes should take lives, even if it was against those labeled as villains who inflicted harm on others. But at that moment, the green-haired boy felt little concern for the villains who cared only for their own desires for power. In the simulation event unit at USJ, tension hung thick in the air as Izuku faced the villains without fear. He had just learned that the monster responsible for severely injuring his teacher and killing Shiro, his Shikigami, was a weapon designed to defeat or eliminate All Might, the #1 hero in Japan. Next to the giant with the exposed brains stood Shigaraki, who seemed to be the mastermind behind the chaos unfolding alongside the sudden attack on the UFC. He was also the only one that Nomu listened to and obeyed without question. Midoriya diverted his gaze to where his white jade dog lay lifeless on the ground, its eyes unfocused and devoid of life. This sight darkened the expression on the green-haired boy's face even further. He then watched as Shiro's body dissolved into a pool of darkness, which caught the attention of the villain with the hands, who found it curious that dogs behaved this way in death. After a few moments, Shigaraki focused his attention on the student who had come to his teacher's aid. Observing the boy's hero costume, which was quite simple compared to the colorful and flashy outfits of other professional heroes, he noted how it seemed to lack the flair meant to impress citizens or enhance their powers. The boy appeared much smaller than Nomu and looked quite upset, likely due to the death of his dog, which was evident in his eyes, alongside a strange abyss that seemed to linger there. Izuku was also analyzing the opponents before him. The most dangerous among them appeared to be the fog villain and the so-called super weapon created to defeat All Might. They clearly possessed abilities that could pose a significant threat to him. He could only see the man with the hands and Nomu, and he felt that he could defeat the man with the hands easily if he could first get rid of the giant with the exposed brain. However, something told him it wouldn't be that simple, as he doubted the man with the hands would remain passive while he fought his puppet. Another issue was that Azui and Mineta were hiding among the bushes in the forest zone, observing the scene. He hesitated to engage in battle with them nearby, so he repressed his desire for revenge for his white jade dog. With a firm determination in his eyes, he decided to focus on how to win this fight correctly, knowing that neither Nomu nor Shigaraki would let him leave after revealing himself. Aizawa was still being overwhelmed by the biological weapon. One of his arms was broken, and the skin on his left elbow was torn, a result of Shigaraki's ability to disintegrate it during their fight. Had he not moved in time, he could have lost half of his arm. But the worst part was that one of his students was there with him. He believed Midoriya was intelligent, as he had shown great promise in recent training sessions. Yet now, he faced an extraordinary evil that seemed merciless toward anyone in its path. He wanted to tell Izuku to run, but his voice wouldn't come, and he barely had the strength to rise. Everything seemed lost for him and his student. Or perhaps not. Shigaraki grew tired of waiting and stepped forward, ready to end the life of the student just as he had with the dog. However, before he could advance, a purple mist appeared beside him, prompting him to look toward his servant, Kurojairi, who had manifested unexpectedly. This surprised him momentarily, as he had ordered Kurojairi to distribute the students, and his presence indicated something important was amiss. Kurojairi informed Shigaraki that he had successfully distributed all the present students throughout the building as ordered. However, he regrettably mentioned that one of them had managed to escape. Shigaraki fell silent, staring at Kurojairi for a moment before looking toward the horizon. Though his face was obscured, the annoyance and anger he felt were palpable at the thought of not being able to deal with so many professional heroes with so little advantage. Even Nomu would struggle against the symbol of peace if that many heroes were on his side. It was incredibly frustrating. The entire plan was falling apart because of Kurojairi. He would have killed him on the spot if he weren't his only option for escaping before disaster struck when those heroes arrived to neutralize them. He expressed his frustration, stating that he would kill Kurojairi if he could, but being a portal made that impossible. He raked his fingers along his neck with enough force to redden his skin, lamenting that they could not fight against so many heroes who could arrive at any moment, especially with the child they had lost potentially reaching the academy. Everything was falling apart because of someone else. Midoriya stood still, fixated on the man with the hands, who, compared to the symbol of peace, appeared much thinner and seemed malnourished, making him look weaker. Yet, his instincts warned him to be cautious, as the man could inflict damage that would be difficult to recover from. Notably, he behaved like a small child who became frustrated when things didn't go his way, clearly upset that his plan was unraveling. There was still something to be done before the villains decided to leave. The green-haired boy's gaze remained locked on the villain with the exposed brain, who seemed lost in thought, not entirely human. Midoriya couldn't fathom what lay behind that robust and intimidating exterior, but he was determined to strike when the opportunity arose. Shigaraki shifted his focus back to Midoriya, lowering his head to look directly at him. The boy was merely trying to be brave, seeking vengeance for his dog while also attempting to rescue Aizawa, which was a poor strategy. Nomu possessed immense strength even without his quirk, designed to absorb the blows from All Might, along with an extraordinary regenerative ability that allowed him to heal from injuries that even Recovery Girl could not mend. Now that their plan had been ruined, it was necessary to send a warning to the heroes about how powerful they were. The villain glared at the boy in front of him, speaking in an intimidating tone. They could not face so many heroes. With their current strength, it would be impossible. However, they could damage the pride of the symbol of peace before he arrived to witness the devastation he could not prevent. Nomu was ordered to attack, with a finger pointed at Midoriya. The creature, with its exposed brain, leaned forward and vanished in a burst of speed, kicking up dust as it approached Midoriya. Its fist was raised, just inches from the green-haired boy's face, a blow that could crush anyone's skull. Aizawa, who was barely conscious, regained a moment of awareness to see the devastating punch aimed at one of his students, feeling powerless to intervene. Everything seemed lost. Or perhaps not. Suddenly, a massive white serpent with a black outline emerged from the ground, its eyes marked with a strange symbol. Mineta, Azui, Shigaraki, and Kurogiri were taken aback as they witnessed such an overwhelming creature rise from the floor, capturing Nomu in its jaws and lifting him nearly to the ceiling of the USJ, its fangs sinking into the villain's abdomen. Nomu struggled to free himself from Orochi's sudden attack. The shadow of the boy extended beneath him, and quickly, Nu emerged, soaring into the air towards Orochi's head. The villains were momentarily stunned by the boy's strange ability to manifest what appeared to be a dark portal from which these beasts emerged. Following Midoriya's command, Nu and Orochi attacked together, striking Nomu, who was still struggling to escape. The blow from one of the owl's wings, summoned by Midoriya, stunned Nomu, sending a strong electric current through him, but it was regulated to avoid harming Orochi. Midoriya focused his thoughts on attacking Nomu while keeping an eye on Shigaraki and his ally Kurogiri. The remaining villains looked at Midoriya in surprise, not expecting such a powerful attack from him, which made them doubt his combat abilities. Kurogiri was the first to react, creating a portal behind Midoriya in an attempt to make him fall inside, putting him at a disadvantage for Shigaraki. However, when it seemed that the green-haired boy would be absorbed by the portal, nothing happened. He remained unaffected, leaving the villains confused for several seconds. Suddenly, Nomu was released from Orochi's jaws, dropping through the air with 2 red marks still visible on his abdomen, only to be struck again by Nu, who charged and sent him flying away with a burst of energy, small bolts of electricity sparking from his body as he fell to the ground. Shigaraki watched Nomu descend and ordered Kurogiri to assist him, shaking off his surprise as he tried to save the biological weapon they would need later. Then, Shigaraki felt a strange sense of danger behind him, forcing him to glance over his shoulder. He saw the green-haired boy had appeared out of nowhere behind him, emerging from the dark portal below. Shigaraki turned quickly but could not block a large black-bladed sword that cut into his forearm, drawing crimson blood and tearing his clothing in the process. This was a trick Midoriya had learned before this journey, starting with a simple question. If he could hide objects in his shadow, could he hide himself in the shadows of others? That question had been on his mind since the beginning of the fight, and fortunately, it worked. He instinctively knew how to do it, achieving the remarkable feat of hiding in the shadows and then emerging beneath Shigaraki, who was caught off guard by the attack. Returning to the fight, Kurogiri shifted his attention to Midoriya instead of rescuing Nomu, who had fallen into the forest zone, crashing to the ground and colliding with trees. The mist villain extended his fog towards the green-haired boy, who quickly dodged the first attack and moved closer to Shigaraki, positioning himself behind him, holding his arm and placing the sword's blade against his neck to keep him in place. Kurogiri dissipated his mist before it could reach Midoriya and his hostage, observing from a distance for a way to attack. The pressure of the sword against Shigaraki's neck kept him restrained, ready for any resistance. Despite wanting to avenge Shiro, the teenager began to deduce that Nomu was merely a puppet following the orders of the villain with the hands. Killing Nomu would not stop the giant with the exposed brain from obeying someone else, so he needed to eliminate the one responsible for his Shikigami's death first, aiming for a more fair fight, so to speak. Shigaraki attempted to struggle against the boy holding him, but Midoriya pressed his weapon harder against the villain's neck, providing a clear incentive to comply, otherwise, he would cut him in half. This was the first time a kid had taken him hostage, and Shigaraki asked if he had experience in such situations while raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. Midoriya replied that he was not experienced but learned quickly, inquiring about Shigaraki's quirk, noting that his mist friend could create portals. However, if they were here, it was because they had gathered information. Still, they wanted to separate them because they didn't know what abilities they possessed. The grip on the sword tightened as one of them held Shigaraki in a vulnerable position, ready to strike. The tension in the air was palpable. Kurojairi faced a difficult situation. He couldn't make a move that would lead to dire consequences later. The boy had his master in a precarious hold, where a single action could end Shigaraki's life. Yet, he didn't believe a mere student could take a life, as that was not what a typical aspiring hero would do. However, something felt off about that boy. Before the battle began, his cold, dark gaze was fixed on Nomu, filled with a hatred that promised death, which was undeniably terrifying. No boy should harbor such intentions, especially one training to be a hero. Shigaraki couldn't use his quirk or make any sudden movements, as he had no idea what ability the boy had that kept him captive. He sensed that if he managed to outmaneuver the boy, he could break free from his hold. He didn't think the child was capable of taking a life, as that was not characteristic of a hero, and that thought clouded Shigaraki's judgment, preventing him from seeing clearly what was in front of him or rather, the boy behind him. As the tension escalated among the three, a sudden electrifying sound filled the air above them. Kurojairi was the first to look up and saw a massive owl soaring overhead, its wings crackling with electricity. Moments later, a powerful discharge shot towards the villain, who opened a portal to evade the attack. However, the discharge from Nu was actually aimed at Midoriya, who had pulled away, releasing Shigaraki abruptly. A surge of electricity struck the villain, causing him to cry out in pain. Kurojairi was momentarily stunned, distracted by the boy who had drawn his attention to the bird above, thinking it would attack. Instead, it incapacitated the leader of the operation. The green-haired boy glanced at the fog villain before running directly toward him, raising his sword as he passed by the fallen and dazed Shigaraki, who lay on the ground. The fog villain was taken aback when the boy approached, attempting to strike at his gaseous form, but he was unable to inflict any damage. Kurojairi seized the opportunity to retaliate, extending his mist toward Midoriya. Inside the villain's fog, Midoriya could see clearly where the device that seemed to be the living fog's body was located. Yet he couldn't get closer as the wind generated pushed him back, prompting him to flee. Izuku jumped, stretching his arm as high as he could above the mist, hoping it would break through. Suddenly, a flapping sound filled the air as Nu appeared, grabbing his arm with its talons and lifting him away from the scene, leaving the fallen Shigaraki and Kurojairi watching as the boy flew away, still clutching his sword. They would have to deal with him later or perhaps escape before reinforcements arrived at the USJ. In the air, Nu carried Izuku alongside Aizawa, who was unconscious on the owl's back. While airborne, Midoriya scanned the area, trying to spot anyone else nearby to ensure his professor was safe while he returned to confront the villains. He wasn't just going back to fight, he also needed to check if Mineta and Azui were still safe, hidden in the forest zone where the villain with the exposed brain had fallen, which could pose a danger to them. As he lowered his gaze, he noticed some students at the entrance of the USJ, tending to the injuries of hero number 13, who was in her damaged suit and appeared severely hurt. Izuku ordered Nu to descend toward his classmates, spotting those who had faced Kurojairi, unaware of the latter's involvement. They noticed someone approaching from the sky and recognized it as Midoriya's Shikigami. The owl descended closer to the ground, flapping its wings until it landed, releasing Izuku, who calmly surveyed his classmates before looking toward Aizawa, who also dismounted from the back of the Shikigami. After helping his professor down, Nu vanished into a pool of darkness, as the boy no longer needed the assistance of his winged companion for the moment. Uraraka, surprised to see her teammate, approached him, momentarily leaving Tracy with her friend Ishido. She asked what he was doing there and if that was Aizawa-sensei. As she watched Izuku support his professor, she inquired again about what had happened, noticing the green-haired boy walking beside her with Aizawa over his shoulder. Midoriya carefully approached Tracy, laying Aizawa down next to the injured hero. He examined Aizawa's condition, noting the destruction of his suit and the blood staining his back, along with visible injuries on his arms. Aizawa appeared to be in considerable pain, twisting and groaning slightly. He was in the worst condition of all, with a wound on his forehead that oozed blood, a scar over his right eye, and both arms broken, with skin torn from his elbows as if affected by a corrosive substance. Izuku looked at his classmates, who appeared to be merely tired rather than injured, which relieved him somewhat. His attention needed to be directed toward his two teachers. He stood up from the ground, observing his professors while his classmates watched him, unsure of what he would do next. They doubted his ability to accomplish much, as his quirk was not like Recovery Girl's, which allowed her to heal injuries like those sustained by Aizawa and number 13, who seemed to have struggled while trying to protect them. His thoughts raced as he considered the severity of their injuries. He knew they could only hold on until the other heroes arrived. He still needed to find Tsuyu and Azui, and he was uncertain about the condition of the others but hoped they could survive until help arrived. He focused on the task at hand, recalling how he had tamed his quirk before this journey began, though it was not offensive in nature. He formed the shape of a deer with his hands, calling upon Madoka. The shadow beneath him began to spread, forming a pool from which a giant deer emerged. It was much larger than anyone present, with a white coat and 4 pairs of blue eyes on either side of its face. Its large, robust antlers were adorned with crystal chains, and a unique mark was visible on its skin. The deer let out a soft call upon being summoned and locked eyes with Izuku for a brief moment. He gently requested Madoka to heal his teachers, pointing toward them. Madoka obeyed, moving to stand before Aizawa and number 13, lowering its neck to bring its nose close to Aizawa's head. A white aura began to manifest from the tip of its nose, gradually enveloping both heroes. Ishido, who had been keeping a cautious distance with the others, watched in awe as the wounds on both heroes began to heal rapidly. They could see Aizawa's broken arms returning to their original position, accompanied by the sound of cracking bones, while the lacerated skin of number 13 magically reconstructed itself until no trace of their injuries remained. Once Madoka had finished healing both heroes, Izuku approached the deer he had summoned. While it was not a Shikigami known for brute strength, it had the remarkable ability to heal others effectively. He thanked Madoka for its assistance and commanded it to return to the shadows. Now, his teachers were practically as good as new, but they needed time to regain consciousness. Until then, Izuku had other matters to address. He called out to Uraraka, who looked at him with surprise. He turned to face his classmates, his gaze fixed on her to ensure she was paying attention. He entrusted her and the others with the task of protecting Aizawa and number 13, asking if one of them had managed to escape to inform the school. Though taken aback, Uraraka nodded slightly. He urged them to be careful, reminding them that villains could still be lurking around the academy, and they needed to ensure their safety. Uraraka and the others were astonished as Izuku suddenly vanished, absorbed by a small pool of darkness. The students of Class 1A were left processing the incredible sight of their mysterious and intimidating classmates summoning a strange beast that emitted a white energy, healing their teachers' extensive wounds that could have left them incapacitated until Recovery Girl arrived. It was remarkable to witness how Midoriya had stepped up in such a critical moment, showcasing the incredible potential of his quirk. Villains began to emerge from the center of the USJ fountain, searching for something but failing to spot the students. The Class 1A students remained on high alert, ready for another confrontation. Meanwhile, Izuku found himself in the forest zone after slipping through the shadows, determined to locate his classmates. Fearing that the villains might have found them first, he quickly summoned Kuro, his black demon dog, to track down Azui and Mineta as swiftly as possible. The dog obeyed, using its keen sense of smell to detect the scent of Izuku's friends. After a few moments, Kuro barked and darted off in a direction through the underbrush, with Izuku following closely behind. He recalled that this was the same area where Orochi had thrown Nomu into the air. He needed to be cautious, as he was unsure how merciful that creature would be toward his classmates. While Azui was strong, Mineta was not as formidable. However, Izuku had witnessed Nomu's overwhelming speed and knew he had to be careful when facing it. If his friends were still alive, Kuro would have already picked up their scent. He continued running through the forest until he reached a small clearing, where he spotted 3 silhouettes in the distance. As he got closer, he recognized Izuku alongside his Shikigami, with Tsuyu and Mineta standing in front of a villain with an exposed brain, who remained silent and still, watching the 2 students. The smaller boy stood behind the girl, preparing for any sudden movements. When they heard the sound of someone approaching, the boy and girl turned their attention to Izuku, whom they hadn't seen since he summoned that large serpent and captured the leader responsible for this attack, neutralizing him on the ground with a powerful electric shock from his unusual large owl, which then carried him away. As Midoriya moved away, they decided it was best to leave, realizing it wasn't wise to linger around those villains any longer. On their way out of the forest zone, they encountered the villain with the exposed brain, who did not attack but merely stood there, watching them in silence, as if waiting for instructions. That was until he spotted a certain green-haired boy, whom he had been ordered to eliminate. Without hesitation, he adjusted his stance and lunged towards Izuku once more. Izuku noticed that the wounds Orochi had inflicted on Nomu had already healed, which struck him as odd. He assumed Nomu possessed a regenerative ability that allowed him to heal, a rather unusual gift in these times. Izuku thought to himself, reflecting on his own abilities as he glanced at his weapon. He advanced, analyzing his opponent, who physically surpassed him in many ways. He saw the weapon come at him again in an instant, fist aimed directly at him. With no time to dodge, he leaned back as far as he could. Anyone would have thought he was attempting to evade the blow by bending backward, but instead he slipped half of his body beneath his shadow, allowing the strike to miss entirely. Seizing the moment, he rolled to the side, distancing himself from Nomu. The exposed brain beast shifted its gaze toward him and moved in a blink, attempting to deliver a powerful blow to his abdomen. It came within inches of him, but only a metallic sound echoed as it struck a dark surface Izuku had conjured to block the potentially devastating hit that could have crushed his ribcage. Midoriya leaned forward, pushing his sword to keep Nomu at bay, then created some distance to launch a series of cuts that tore into the beast's flesh, revealing its blood. However, the wounds closed almost as quickly as they opened, which surprised the green-haired boy. Undeterred, he attacked again, landing cuts on the beast's arms and abdomen. Noma didn't even bother to block the initial strikes, which healed almost instantly, before launching another powerful blow. Izuku quickly rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding it. As he regained his footing, he looked directly at Nomu and addressed his companions, still vigilant of the beast. He instructed them to run to the entrance of the USJ where the others were, assuring them he would handle the creature. He glanced at them momentarily, urging them to start running. Mineta and Tiu exchanged glances before quickly nodding and sprinting in another direction through the forest, trying to reach the location Izuku had mentioned. Although they were somewhat skeptical about the green-haired boy's words, fearing there might be no one waiting for them when they arrived, they decided to trust him, not wanting to witness the intense battle that was about to unfold. Meanwhile, Deku resumed his combat stance with his sword, facing Nomu, who seemed ready to charge at him again, a tactic that would have been effective if he had advanced directly, preventing Izuku from keeping pace. Instead, Kuro appeared behind Nomu and began barking to grab its attention, causing the emotionless biological weapon to turn its gaze toward the dog. Izuku seized this moment of distraction to charge at Nomu once more. Midoriya deactivated his quirk, making his demon dog vanish in a swirl of darkness. He leaped off a nearby rock, using the momentum to deliver a downward slash aimed at Nomu's exposed brain. Unfortunately, the villain blocked the attack with his forearm, sustaining a minor scratch that proved ineffective. While still in the air, the green-haired boy realized he was at a disadvantage, unable to maintain his balance. He hesitated for a moment, which Nomu exploited by delivering a right hook. Izuku managed to block as best he could with his back, but the force of the blow sent him hurtling sideways into the forest, rolling along the ground. Izuku growled in frustration and planted his sword into the ground to halt his momentum. He quickly regained his composure and looked ahead, but before he could react, Nomu's fist struck his forehead, pushing him back without forcing him to drop his sword. He attempted to defend himself with another slash, which hit the right side of Nomu's abdomen but had no effect. Nomu retaliated with powerful blows that Izuku could barely block, pushing him back painfully and frustratingly. Nomu dragged Izuku deeper into the forest, away from the clearing where he had encountered his friends. The boy defended himself as best he could against Nomu's relentless attacks, feeling the beast's strength reverberate through his arms. He held onto his sword until Nomu delivered a direct hit to his chest, which he failed to block. The impact arched his back forward, sending him flying backward until he landed near the fountain at the Ue. The green-haired boy felt pain coursing through his body, especially in his abdomen and arms from trying to shield himself from the villain's blows. He seemed to have hit his head during the impact, as blood trickled down his forehead. Leaning against the fountain to catch his breath, he could see Nomu's silhouette emerging from the depths of the forest, slowly advancing toward him. Izuku thought to himself about the overwhelming strength of his opponent, realizing that physical attacks seemed to have little effect and that Nomu could heal his own wounds. He clenched his teeth, lifting his gaze to see the villain with his exposed brain. It was clear that Nomu was nearly as strong as All Might, designed as a weapon to defeat him. Midoriya slowly began to rise from the fountain, feeling the ache in his body. He picked up the sword he had dropped and watched as Nomu stepped out from the underbrush, stopping in front of him once more. The biological weapon tilted its head, grinning widely at Izuku as he stood up, glaring back with hatred. The villain taunted him, claiming that he was holding back but would fight seriously if Izuku insisted. They exchanged a brief stare before Nomu leaned forward again. Suddenly, the ground beneath Nomu's feet began to crack, creating a massive opening. From it emerged a gigantic serpent, which captured Nomu in its jaws, lifting him into the air before releasing him abruptly, causing him to crash to the ground. The serpent raised its body, revealing its fangs before hissing and lunging at Nomu. The villain, sensing the imminent danger, swiftly dodged the attack. The serpent continued its assault, striking at Nomu with powerful bites that shattered the ground with each impact, gradually cornering him. Nomu attempted to strike back, but the serpent skillfully evaded, wrapping its long body around him, pressing against his bones. Nomu struggled against the serpent's constricting grip, instinctively resisting the pressure that threatened to crush him. Though he had a quirk that allowed him to regenerate quickly, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen if all his bones broke or if his head were to separate from his neck under the serpent's force. Amidst the tension, Izuku appeared, sword in hand, and plunged the tip into Nomu's shoulder, driving it deep to test how far he could reach toward the heart of the beast. Together, the green-haired boy and his Shikigami had the creature under control, but it was clear that more was needed to secure their victory. Izuku still had unfinished business with the weapon created to eliminate the symbol of peace. Gripping the hilt of his sword, he withdrew its blade from the villain's shoulder and raised it high, commanding Orochi to ease the pressure just enough for Nomu to release one of his arms, which Izuku had planned all along. He aimed his sword at Nomu's wrist, intending to stab the center and slice sideways, severing the hand. Orochi fully released the biological weapon, freeing its body, and prepared to lunge at Izuku once more. The serpent opened its massive jaws and bit down on Nomu's arm, sinking its fangs into the forearm and part of the bicep. The beast writhed as the serpent's fangs pressed against the tendons of its arm. In an attempt to escape, the villain pushed his arm beneath Orochi's jaw, trying to free himself, but suddenly felt a sharp pain in his abdomen. He looked down to see the black sword piercing his torso near the ribs, leaving him immobilized between the serpent and the broccoli creature that held him captive. As his wounds began to heal, Izuku pulled his sword from the beast's ribs and stabbed him again in the same spot, this time with greater force, reopening the injuries. The battle seemed to stretch on, with the difference being that Nomu, despite his severe injuries, could still heal. Izuku knew that eventually he would tire, as maintaining such powerful Shikigami like Orochi drained his energy. Despite having a significant advantage, the outcome of the fight remained uncertain. If Nomu's wounds healed before Izuku could finish him off, the tide could turn. However, Izuku had devised a plan to counteract his opponent's healing abilities with Orochi's loyal assistance. After a minute, the serpent released its grip on the biological weapon, and Izuku withdrew his sword from the beast's ribs, stepping back alongside Orochi, who coiled protectively around his master while hissing menacingly, ready for the villain's next move. Nomu allowed his wounds to regenerate, quickly healing his severed hand and closing the gap in his ribs. He appeared unfazed by the attacks from the boy, who was much weaker than him, and if he chose to confront him in a direct fight, it was clear that Midoriya would not do so, as he had already gained the upper hand since the struggle began. He just needed to wait for the corrosive effect to take hold. Suddenly, Nomu froze in place, and moments later he fell to his knees, blood pouring from his mouth and staining the ground. His breathing became irregular as he desperately opened his jaws, struggling to draw air into his lungs. His bulging eyes lost focus, and he leaned forward, collapsing to the ground. Despite his extraordinary regenerative abilities, they were ineffective against Orochi's venom, which consumed its victims from the inside out, causing symptoms like yellow and purple skin, convulsions, difficulty breathing, and internal organ damage. Above all, it inflicted immense pain, a torment that was nearly unbearable, causing the biological weapon to writhe in agony on the floor. Izuku observed with a cold gaze as he slowly approached Nomu, passing by his Shikigami, who remained still and silent, watching what his master would do next. Izuku gripped his sword firmly and moved closer to Nomu, kicking him to roll him onto his back so he could look directly at him. He was uncertain about what he would do now that he had the biological weapon at his mercy, unsure if he would truly follow through with his initial intentions. The green-haired boy positioned himself over the biological weapon and stared intently as it gasped for air, its skin turning yellow with dark purple spreading across its body. He questioned what it truly was while tightening his grip on the sword. Nomu groaned and writhed, spitting blood, unable to respond. Izuku commanded him to be silent, raising his sword, determined to deliver the final blow. Strike after strike, Izuku landed blows on the beast's abdomen near its heart, which writhed and groaned in pain until his sword finally pierced an artery close to the vital organ. Nomu gasped in agony, struggling to breathe until, at last, the biological weapon created to kill the symbol of peace was shattered by a 14-year-old boy, who had taken a life for the first time and was unsure of what he should feel in that moment. Perhaps he would figure it out with time, but not now. Izuku rose from the ground, withdrawing his sword from the chest of the fallen villain. He walked over to where Orochi was and uttered the word return. The serpent dissolved into a pool of darkness, just like Izuku's other Shikigami. The green-haired boy stumbled for a few seconds before collapsing to the ground, sitting there as pain coursed through his body, still feeling the effects of his battle with Nomu. He had little energy left to summon Madoka for healing, feeling strangely exhausted for the first time. That biological weapon had undoubtedly provided him with a significant training experience. It hurt a lot, but he had won, Izuku thought as he leaned his sword against the ground. Despite having taken the life of a being he barely understood, he felt the weight of his actions. Killing someone was no easy feat, and those words echoed in his mind, overwhelming him. He wondered about the consequences of his actions, having ended a villain's life, even if that villain could have killed him too. He hoped he wouldn't have to fight again until he regained some energy. A sound caught his attention from the right, making him turn alertly, expecting another villain. Instead, he saw Bakugo and Todoroki together, both of whom had witnessed the intense battle he had fought against the villain. Bakugo looked surprised, realizing that Deku had accomplished all of that on his own, without anyone's help, aside from his strange beasts. Izuku paused for a moment, feeling discomfort in his body as he looked toward the girl, thinking it would be easier to talk to her than to Bakugo. Todoroki approached him, her usual tone softening slightly as she noticed his injuries. She explained that they were waiting for the professional heroes to arrive and had gathered most of the group at the entrance of the USJ. She urged him to come with them, as there were injured people who needed his help. Izuku thought for a moment, recalling that Uraraka had likely asked him to heal Aizawa-sensei and Tracy. He nodded in agreement. As Deku and Todoroki began to walk, Bakugo snapped out of his shock, staring at the fallen Nomu. The creature's yellowed skin and multiple stab wounds near its heart gave it a grim appearance, its lifeless eyes adding to the eerie scene. It was unsettling to think that the green-haired boy he often teased had been capable of defeating such a beast. Before they could move on, a sudden sense of danger arose from a portal that opened behind them, putting the three teens on high alert as they faced the returning villains. Kurojire's eyes appeared through the mist, and from it emerged Shigaraki, his clothes singed and bearing various burns, yet he seemed able to walk without difficulty. Izuku readied himself for combat, gripping his sword tightly despite his injuries. He felt grateful to have his friends by his side this time, hoping they could support him if a fight broke out. He didn't want to rely on his Shikigamis, as he struggled to think clearly enough to summon them. Shigaraki glanced at Izuku, then at the fallen Nomu, realizing the extent of its damage and the unexpected defeat it had suffered at the hands of a child like Izuku. Frustration bubbled within Shigaraki as he contemplated ways to eliminate Izuku as soon as the opportunity arose. However, he was aware that time was a dilemma. He didn't know how long it would take for the heroes to arrive, and they needed to leave before that happened. They had to take the fallen Nomu with them to gather its genetic material and recreate a monster like it. The tension among the three teens escalated, and Bakugo made the first move, leaning forward and launching an explosion toward the villains, filling the area with smoke and obscuring the scene. When the smoke cleared, it revealed Shigaraki, unharmed and covered by Kurojire's mist, standing next to a massive crater where Bakugo's attack had been redirected. Izuku sighed, realizing that his friend's impulsive attack had failed, as he hadn't assessed the situation before charging at a villain capable of teleporting attacks. He looked at Bakugo, trying to reason with him before he launched another attack, noticing his frustration at missing his first strike. He suggested that they retreat for now, speaking in a serious and tired tone while wiping some blood from his forehead. He pointed out that the villains didn't seem eager to fight, and it would be best to leave before testing that theory, as the professionals must be on their way. He held Bakugo's gaze for a moment before the latter shot him a fierce look. Bakugo shouted that he would defeat the villains on his own and prove his strength when the heroes arrived. He warned Izuku not to try to stop him, insisting that these villains were no match for him. Izuku sighed and turned away, conceding to Bakugo's determination. He wished Bakugo luck in his battle, confident that the villains would be surprised by him. As he prepared to leave, Bakugo and Todoroki were taken aback by how easily Midoriya accepted the request to retreat. He walked calmly away from the villains, resting his sword on his shoulder, his face showing signs of pain and fatigue as he made his way in the opposite direction. As Kaken emerged from his surprise, he grinned widely, leaning forward and assuming his combat stance. Small explosions erupted from his quirk, appearing threatening to the villains in the distance. The girl with bicolor hair, watching Midoriya move away, spoke to Bakugo in an attempt to reason with him. She expressed her concerns, suggesting that it wouldn't be wise for him to face those villains alone. She reminded him that, as Midoriya had said, the heroes were on their way, and fighting them would be an irrational way to prove his strength. Bakugo ignored her, his gaze fixed on the villains with a malicious grin, preparing to charge at them. He turned to Midoriya, seeking his support, asking if he agreed with his decision. Midoriya paused for a moment, addressing Todoroki with his usual serious tone, though tinged with a hint of regret. He expressed his frustration with Bakugo's incessant shouting, likening it to dealing with a dog chasing its own tail, making it futile to reason with him given his determination. He added that he was exhausted from fighting the Nomu, and Bakugo stepping in as his opponent was beneficial for him. Todoroki sensed Izuku's regret towards Bakugo, hinting at a deeper history between them. However, he couldn't dwell on that thought as another loud explosion rang out, prompting him to turn and see Bakugo launching another explosion at Kurojire and Shigaraki. The villain of Mist skillfully redirected the projectiles, causing Bakugo to grow increasingly frustrated as he missed his targets, shaking the ground with each failed attempt. The girl stepped back, wary of the chaos around her, unsure when Kurogyari would redirect one of Bakugo's explosions toward her and Midoriya, causing her to question Bakugo's judgment in this situation. Clenching his teeth, Todoroki began to retreat alongside Midoriya, distancing themselves from the battle scene and leaving Bakugo to face the two villains alone. As soon as his friends left, a portal opened beneath Bakugo, unleashing a blinding explosion that sent him flying, leaving him momentarily dazed from his own attack. Struggling to regain his footing, he opened his eyes to find the cold gaze of Shigaraki, who looked down on him with disdain for daring to challenge them without a clear advantage. Bakugo seized the villain's arm, creating explosions that caused minor damage to Shigaraki, who merely stepped back, releasing Bakugo and revealing a slightly burned arm. As soon as he was free, Bakugo charged at Shigaraki, throwing his signature right hook. The villain anticipated the move, summoning a portal in front of him, causing Bakugo's punch to miss entirely. Another portal appeared in front of Bakugo, and he received his own punch directly to the face, staggering him back. Undeterred, he pulled his arm from the portal and aimed a kick at Shigaraki, who caught his leg with his hands. Using his quirk against Bakugo, he began to inflict pain, causing the boy to grunt in discomfort. In a burst of determination, Bakugo unleashed a powerful explosion, creating enough distance to escape the villains, though he landed awkwardly, wincing in pain from his injured leg. Angry and assessing the situation, Bakugo realized that Kurogyari was the primary threat, as he was protecting Shigaraki. However, with his leg injured, close combat was not an option, forcing him to rely on long-range attacks. The challenge was that Kurogyari could easily create portals to deflect his explosions, potentially sending them back at him. It was a difficult situation for Bakugo. The villain taunted him, remarking on how his friends had abandoned him, emphasizing the reality of heroes and aspiring heroes. Bakugo scowled, still in his combat stance, though his injured leg was slightly raised. He declared that he didn't need anyone and could handle it on his own before launching another explosion at Shigaraki. Shigaraki remained in place, finding the fight with Bakugo dull. He anticipated All Might's arrival to witness the power of his Nomu, but with the hero incapacitated, he had no intention of wasting time. As he thought this, another portal opened, absorbing Bakugo's explosion and redirecting it back at him. Unable to dodge due to his injured leg, Bakugo took the full brunt of the blast and fell to the ground. As he attempted to rise again, he noticed the villains preparing to leave, taking the biological weapon with them through a larger portal that could accommodate all three. Before departing, Shigaraki glanced back at Bakugo, expressing his disinterest in killing him, as it would only waste time. He conveyed a message to relay to All Might, stating that the Nomu was not in a condition to face him. He paused, then added a more menacing tone, warning that sooner or later, All Might would witness the true terror that awaited him. As the villains prepared to leave, Bakugo gritted his teeth, refusing to accept defeat and feeling powerless to stop them. Since his training with the symbol of peace, he had been plagued by thoughts of failure, feeling like a loser in this moment. Using all the strength he had left, he stood up to run toward the villains, trying to reach Shigaraki to unleash another explosion with his outstretched right arm. As he extended it, he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a minibar through the portal. Before Bakugo could complete his attack, the portal closed abruptly like a guillotine, catching his arm in the process. He couldn't pull back in time, and the consequences were clear to everyone. A loud scream echoed throughout the chapter and location, Unforeseen Event Simulation Facility USJ. The students of Class 1A gathered at the entrance of the USJ, while some were scattered across the various disaster simulation areas around the building. Among them were Izuku and Todoroki, who managed to work together to coordinate their ideas with their classmates, successfully bringing many of them to the entrance. Although there were still villains lurking that they needed to face, the green-haired boy and his bicolor-haired friend were more than enough to neutralize them. Despite feeling exhausted, Deku remained determined and used his Shikigami, Madoka, to heal his wounds, which proved effective thanks to its healing abilities. Training Madoka had been a wise decision before coming, and he knew he had to be careful not to lose it in battle, as he had with Shiro, or it could cost him dearly. Suddenly, the doors of the USJ swung open, revealing a muscular man with blonde hair who wore a slight smile, though concern was evident in his eyes. It was All Might, who had rushed to the building after receiving news from Lita, who had sprinted to UA. The hero had rested enough to maintain his heroic form for an extended PRD. He entered through the main doors, announcing his arrival with a reassuring presence. The students felt a wave of relief wash over them at the sight of the symbol of peace. His presence brought comfort, knowing that such a powerful hero had come to their aid during their struggle against the unexpected villains. It was curious to think about what the students would feel if they knew that Toshinori's power was waning and that he could only maintain his current form for about 2 hours at most. This was something the smiling hero kept in mind as he quickly scanned the area for anyone in need of help or injured. Toshinori noticed his students, who appeared physically exhausted, some with minor bruises or scrapes on their arms and legs. Fortunately, none had life-threatening injuries, which brought him some relief. He shifted his gaze to a boy who intrigued him, wondering how he would react to the situation, especially since he had not seen him before. He quickly spotted Midoriya assisting some of his classmates, carrying them swiftly to a safer area before returning to help others. It was clear that he was very tired, and his hero costume was worn and torn, yet he stood firm, displaying a strong will that kept him on his feet. However, there was no time to dwell on that. He needed to focus on all the points he might be missing around him. A trembling voice called out to him from the ground. It was Mineta, who had crawled to All Might's feet, his eyes watery with relief at seeing the hero nearby. He had been desperate for All Might to arrive before the situation escalated further. All Might looked at his students, noting that they had held up remarkably well until his arrival. This was a significant achievement for them, one that would help them improve in the future as they aspired to become professional heroes and join a hero agency for training, earning credit for overcoming this challenge in their journey toward becoming professionals. All Might offered a warm smile to his students, acknowledging their efforts. He expressed his pride in their ability to endure and stay safe up to that point, asking how they were doing and if everyone was together. Uraraka, who was with Shiro, Mina, and Satu, was looking after their teachers, who appeared to be resting to regain their strength, though they were not seriously injured, just their costumes slightly torn from the earlier battle. All Might noticed Tracy and Aizawa, who seemed regretful for not arriving sooner, though he felt relieved that they were safe. It struck him as odd that they were resting without any visible injuries, making him wonder if they had received assistance before he arrived. The round-faced girl noticed the confusion in her teacher's eyes and offered a brief explanation. She reassured him that they were fine, just a bit tired. Todoroki and Deku had helped keep the villains occupied while the others searched for their classmates. She then glanced at Aizawa and Tracy, her expression turning serious as she explained that they had sustained serious injuries, but Deku had managed to heal them with one of his unusual creatures, which had worked wonders. All Might was slightly taken aback, realizing that Midoriya had been capable of healing both of his teachers. This piqued his curiosity about the boy's quirk. Although he had previously reviewed the students' files, he still knew very little about Midoriya's abilities or his personal life. Delving into the young hero's past before arriving at UA was something Toshinori had yet to muster the courage to do, despite his strong curiosity about Midoriya's story and his relationship with his rival, Bakugo. Lost in thought, All Might noticed someone approaching him and recognized it was the daughter of the number 2 hero, accompanied by Kirishima. They had come closer, seemingly unaware of his arrival at the USJ. The red-haired boy looked at All Might, surprised as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. He expressed relief at the hero's presence, acknowledging that while his help would have been beneficial earlier, it was better late than never. Todoroki observed the hero with a slight smile, her sharp teeth visible. She expressed that while she shared the same opinion, it wasn't of much importance at the moment. They had managed to gather half of the class, but they still needed to locate the others. Until then, their whereabouts were unknown, though they hoped everyone was safe. The strongest villains she identified included 4 individuals, one of whom seemed to have damaged the Academy's defense systems. With a light sigh, she turned to her classmates and asked if anyone knew how long it would take for the heroes to arrive. All Might looked at Endeavor's daughter, noting her maturity and methodical approach to the situation. It was impressive, but he focused on answering her question. He stated that the heroes shouldn't take long to arrive, but they couldn't be certain and needed to gather as many students as possible. A serious voice, somewhat tired but audible, mentioned that Bakugo was missing. All Might was startled to hear Midoriya's voice beside him, having not noticed him approach silently after seeing him running from a distance. Now, standing next to him, Midoriya appeared exhausted, his hero costume slightly torn, yet he remained steadfast like Shoto. It caught All Might's attention when Midoriya mentioned that Katsuki was not with them, but his surprise grew when Izuku revealed that the blonde had rushed into battle against some of the most dangerous villains, seemingly the ones who orchestrated the attack. Explosions echoed in the distance, but then they suddenly ceased. All Might was taken aback by what his student had said and the calmness with which he spoke, which was unusual, almost as if he didn't care about what could happen to his friend. Kirishima expressed concern, suggesting they check on Bakugo, fearing he might be in trouble facing those villains alone. Midoriya insisted that Bakugo had said he would be fine. Kirishima, visibly agitated, pointed out that Bakugo's pride was so immense that it blinded him to the danger he was in. All Might felt a bead of sweat trickle down his face before he sprinted down the stairs of the USJ in a flash, finding himself surrounded by several villains by chance. They were quickly neutralized by the smiling hero, who charged through them like a bull, leaping high to get a better view of the chaos around him, especially searching for Bakugo. He spotted him in the distance near the forest zone, lying on the ground with a large pool of blood beneath him. Without hesitation, the symbol of peace descended and jumped again, reaching Bakugo's side in just 90 seconds. He knelt beside the fallen hero, noticing his eyes were closed and up close, he could see that Bakugo was missing his right arm, blood flowing from the wound. The sight of his pale lips, lacking oxygen, compelled All Might to lift him into his arms and leap high into the air, determined to get him to safety. He needed to ensure Bakugo wasn't alone until Recovery Girl could stabilize him. As All Might soared through the air, he noticed a group of 3 students in the ruins zone. 2 girls had their hands raised in surrender, facing a boy with yellow hair and a black lightning bolt-shaped mark on his forehead. This boy was Denki Kaminari, who appeared disoriented, likely from overexerting his quirk during the earlier fight. He was being held by the neck by a villain who threatened to electrocute him, the same villain responsible for cutting off communication within the building. All Might altered his course, landing quietly on one of the mountains in the area. He carefully set Bakugo down on the ground, noting that he was still bleeding. In a hurry, he removed his tie and wrapped it tightly around the stump of Bakugo's amputated arm to stop the bleeding, doing everything he could to prevent him from losing any more blood. He shifted his attention to analyze the situation below him in the mountain zone. Once he had stopped Bakugo's bleeding, he focused on the scene unfolding with the students, noticing the hostage held by a villain wearing a hockey mask. Though he felt the urge to intervene, he knew he had to control his impulses. The young Kaminari could be in serious danger if he made a careless move or revealed his position, so he remained hidden. The professionals were expected to arrive soon to drive back the villains, but prioritizing Bakugo, who was in worse shape than the others, was crucial. He needed to get Bakugo to the other students for their care while he returned to assist Momo and Kyoka alongside Kaminari, who seemed to be in a precarious situation. All Might faced a tough decision, unsure whether to leave the injured Bakugo alone for a moment to help his students or risk the safety of the 2 girls and Kaminari, who could be attacked at any moment. Clenching his teeth and seeing no other options, the symbol of peace decided to take the first choice, leaving Bakugo hidden behind some rocks, hoping no other villains would detect him. He carefully made his way along the mountain's edge, trying to locate the villain with electrical powers, unnoticed by anyone except for the girl with headphones, who spotted the number 1 hero above the villain. She felt a wave of relief upon seeing him but focused on remaining composed, not wanting to reveal her knowledge. Before All Might arrived, various tremors had been felt in several areas of the USJ, shaking the ground primarily due to the devastating blows from Nomu and the powerful movements of Midoriya's Shikigami. Although they were unaware of the cause of the shaking, looking up at the open structures in the mountain zone revealed a massive serpent that seemed to be holding someone in its jaws, a terrifying sight to behold. Although the infamous villains like the deceased Nomu, Shigaraki, and Kurogiri had retreated from the USJ, leaving many students unaware of their names. Several villains still lingered around the building. They had been defeated but could still pose a threat to students like the injured Bakugo or the disoriented Kaminari, who had overexerted himself. Returning to the present, All Might had not yet weakened significantly, as he had not passed on One for All to a potential successor. He still had an hour to maintain his muscular form, during which he carefully observed the villains in front of the two girls, totaling 5, including the one holding Bakugo hostage. He considered his options and quickly assumed a combat stance, preparing to leap at the villains to rescue his students. He aimed to distance himself with them and take them to the entrance of the USJ until the unexpected happened. A remaining villain, who had not noticed All Might, became aware of his presence and the hidden boy. He stealthily approached Bakugo, grabbing him by one shoulder and bringing a knife close to his throat. He called out to All Might, drawing the attention of everyone present, and with a sadistic smile, he suggested ending Bakugo's suffering. All Might turned in surprise, realizing he had overlooked this villain. He stood up abruptly, focusing on the scene before him, quickly noting that Bakugo was now a hostage with a knife dangerously close to his neck. He felt a surge of alarm but refrained from making any sudden movements, aware that the remaining villains had also recognized his position and threatened to harm both students if he did not stay put. It was only a matter of time before they might decide to harm them, depending on the villains' whims, which was incredibly frustrating for the symbol of peace and the two girls, who found themselves in yet another tight situation. All Might reassessed his options, knowing that if he was going to act, he needed to do so quickly, prioritizing Bakugo's rescue while hoping that Kaminari would emerge with treatable injuries for Recovery Girl. However, there remained the risk that Bakugo could fall victim to the villain with the interference quirk. It was a dire situation for everyone involved, and even Midoriya would have taken time to find a way to save both students, risking one over the other. It was difficult to think about everything Izuku had accomplished on this journey, but in a situation like this, external help was desperately needed. Like a Shikigami or someone appearing to save the day, a shot rang out, leaving both the villains and the students, along with All Might, stunned. A spray of red mist filled the air as the villain holding Bakugo staggered back, clutching his shoulder where a bullet had struck. In that instant, the number 1 hero snapped out of his shock and dashed toward Kaken, catching him just before he hit the ground. He noticed how pale Bakugo's skin had become in his dire state. Toshinori thought about the source of the shot as he turned to see where it had come from. At the entrance of the USJ, professional heroes had arrived, and Director Nizu ordered them to prioritize the students' safety. Aizawa and Tracy were unharmed but unconscious, and the shot had been fired by Snipe, who had managed to hit his target from a great distance, saving Bakugo with his impressive aim. The confusion among the villains was seized by Kyoka, who unleashed a powerful sound wave that forced them to release Kaminari, who fell to the ground, unconscious, to recover his strength. The villains were pushed back by the shockwave's impact on their bodies. Seeing that Kaminari was out of danger, All Might quickly scanned the area for the other heroes. He leaped over the mountains with ease, moving away from the simulation zone to reach the professionals. He left the two girls to care for Denki, knowing he had to hurry to get Bakugo to Recovery Girl. Time was of the essence. Bakugo was in a critical state, and All Might feared he might not last another minute. He leaped once more, landing in front of the USJ doors where the heroes were evacuating the remaining students. Nizu, having learned of the events unfolding within his school, hurried to contact the authorities to handle the situation after the heroes had neutralized the villains. He was perched on Snipe's shoulders, allowing him to see Toshinori approaching from a distance, carrying what appeared to be a severely injured teenager. The shock hit him harder when he realized it was Katsuki Bakugo from Class 1A, who was gravely wounded and missing an arm. Nizu quickly ordered the paramedics to take him to Chiyo Shizenji, Recovery Girl, while the other heroes continued to gather the remaining students scattered throughout the USJ. Finally, a sense of immense tranquility washed over him, knowing that everything had come to an end and that the heroes and authorities would take charge from that point on. This also prompted several villains to attempt to flee, but they were swiftly apprehended by heroes like Midnight, Cementos, and Present Mike, who effectively used their abilities to subdue those who believed they could eliminate the symbol of peace. However, not everything was perfect, as the heroes rescued the Class 1A students, some were in better physical condition than others, with Katsuki appearing to be the worst off. Other students like Denki and Toru had also sustained injuries during the fight, though Toru's were due to being trapped in Todoroki's ice, which he hadn't realized she was caught in. At least they managed to capture all the villains they could find, totaling 77, each possessing quite useful and practical abilities for various situations. It was a shame to think about how such extraordinary powers were wasted in the current world, where only the strongest survived. As the professional heroes successfully rescued all the students at the entrance, Recovery Girl could better assess the injured outside the USJ. Nisa dismounted from Snipe's shoulders to survey the surroundings, noting how the villains were being arrested, some still lying on the ground from the combined attacks of the heroes. It was crucial for the director of the country's most prestigious school to know how to respond after an unexpected attack, especially since it negatively affected the students. However, it could also motivate them to become stronger after being involved in such an unplanned situation. The downside was that it could lead to scrutiny from the press, who might question UA's security system, causing public unrest over the villains threatening the academy, which was detrimental to its image. Moreover, one of the students was in critical condition, so they needed to inform his parents about whether he could continue attending the hero course, depending on his recovery, which was unlikely even with Recovery Girl's treatments. In another part of the city, hidden away in a rundown bar, a dark purple portal opened, and Shigaraki emerged. He appeared physically unharmed but was emotionally frustrated, feeling that his grand plan had failed. The students from UA Academy were undoubtedly talented, but there was one among them he hadn't anticipated could stand against his Nomu, who was nearly as strong, if not stronger, than All Might in his current weakened state. It was that curly-haired kid with an emo look, who was surprisingly strong alongside that strange ability of his, allowing him to summon beasts from a dark portal, reminiscent of something out of a fantasy anime. The villain, known for his hands, kicked one of the chairs in front of the bar, visibly irritated. He sat down, burying his head in his hands in desperation as he recalled the indifference with which the boy had looked at him, along with the overwhelming power gap he felt between them. It was peculiar, considering the boy was much smaller, perhaps around 5 feet 7 inches, and didn't seem physically strong. However, what made him truly dangerous was that peculiar ability he used to defeat Nomu. Shigaraki craved revenge. He wanted to eliminate that boy at any cost, but he felt even worse knowing he couldn't act immediately due to the boy's potential. He clenched his teeth beneath his hand, vowing to himself that he would disintegrate that brat the next time they crossed paths. Suddenly, a buzzing sound came from the right side of the villain, where a monitor on the wall lit up, displaying the initials KG. A calm yet serious voice addressed Shigaraki and Kurojairi, asking for a report on their attack at the USJ. Tamura Shigaraki was informed that things hadn't gone well with their plan. It seemed they had underestimated the heroes. At least now, they knew of their existence and that they could strike again whenever they wanted. The voice seemed to smile from the other side of the monitor. Another voice, deeper and more impatient, inquired about the status of his creation, Nomu, eager to know if it was with them. Kurojairi hesitated before confirming that Nomu was indeed there, but it had suffered